Don't any of you have the guts to play for blood?
I'm your huckleberry. That's just my game.
What is up, everybody? Derek here, Myth Vision Podcast. I hope you're doing well. I've been cooking. I've got some scripts in the work that I think are going to be really, really deep. They're going to help people wrap their minds around a lot of what's happening in the New Testament, specifically addressing much of the apologetic claims about eyewitnesses. That has been a huge one, on top of some of the more really conservative Christian apologists who claim undesigned coincidences, right? And they think like they're the ones who really act like if you just had an IQ above 110, you would just be Christian. If you were just smart enough to look at the evidence is just right there in front of your face. Don't you see it? Are you just a dumb? I mean, that's what it boils down to. Are you just a dumb? Are you just not smart enough to recognize the evidence is right there, Derek? It's all just, it's right there, man. Why didn't you just believe? What's going on? You know? I mean, that's what it boils down to. If apologetics wasn't so facts-based, historical-based, we have the evidence-based, it's on our side. I don't think we would have so much to contend here. And here's the interesting part about that before we even dive into Luke. I hope everybody's having a great day. That is that there are many scholars, critical scholars, who will agree with everything I am going to say today. Everything that I will cover today. There's not a single thing I will say today that is dealing with the book of Acts, that is playing. I might even play a clip for you guys I've never made public yet that I just recently recorded. Just like a raw, me and Hugo Mendez talking about John, because people use John as an eyewitness. Like, there's all sorts of material. Not a single thing I'm going to say today that there isn't an academic who is a Christian that's critical scholar, like a rigorous Bible scholar, academic, or even go into the classics world. But of course, you can get those. Dennis McDonald, Richard Miller, Robin Faith Walsh, et cetera, et cetera. The list can go on and on, where they do both. They dabble into both worlds. And they're all going to say, yeah, we see it. We agree. We think you're on the right track. Or they might take a different approach, but it's still a literary one. They're quick to point out forgery. They're quick to point out fabrications. And this is not an atheist, agnostic, driven thing. This is something that I'm like, man, I want the truth. And there are many people, Buddhist, Hindu, I mean, you name it, that study this material as experts in the world and say, yeah, that didn't happen, or that was made up. What's that famous TV guy that we always play clips, little memes? That's not a fact. That's false. That never happened. You know what I'm talking about if you've seen it. Anyway, I hope everybody's doing well. I figure I'd pop in here, say what's up. Roku in the house. Mandy Moorhall, Recording King. Good to see you all. Lisa in the house. Zupiter. Gary, what is good? Gary, good to see you. Bakura, good to see you. Lisa for Faith. Paul was a student of Gamaliel. I very, very much doubt that. Amsa, good to see you. We love you, Derek. We love you back. Derek, love you back. We are Myth Vision, and we're going to talk about the we passages, ladies and gentlemen. Sense of Soul podcast. Hey, Derek, glad to make a live. It's been a while. I'm glad to make a live, right? I hope you had a wonderful holidays, everybody. New Year's, Christmas, if you celebrate it, whatever it is that you do. I hope you all enjoyed, and definitely excited to dive into some of this material, because one of the comments I received from my past video and we got, hold on, Satya, good to see you, is that I am talking about material and it's going over a lot of people's heads. Now, I know someone commented under that and said, dude, if you just watch the last, 1,000 videos, because I think we have over 2,000 videos on this channel. If you watch the last 1,000 videos on this channel, like Derek doesn't need to like break it down for somebody who's literally being introduced. But at the same time, I do that because it's like the best teachers I know were repetitive. They made sure you remember. They tried to repeat because that's a way of memory is repetition. And so you are absorbing the knowledge. Some of you who might even tune in are PhDs, and this stuff is like under you in a sense. I might just be preaching to the choir when it comes to this material that I'm going to discuss. But a lot of you might say, hey, I've read some of that, and some of you might know a lot more about this than I do, but it's new to me to engage it this way, and I get excited. So I wanted to first talk about the we passages because I wrote a recent script, which I recorded the whole thing yesterday, and I cannot recall how many words, but it's over 15,000 words. And the outline of this script is going to engage a few different scholars, and there could have been many more. And I just said, my goodness, if I keep going, my editors will never be able to edit this. We'll never have this video, and no one's going to watch 5-6 hour video. So I do have 3 hours coming, 2.5 to 3 hours coming with this. But I really do hope you'll watch because this is going to break it down, I think, in a way I've never seen a YouTube video do to help people follow along. Anyway, make sure you like the video, share it out there. Let's get some noise over there. And yeah, someone says, I'm waiting for you to do a reaction to Dan's recent video. Which video is that? Just before I get started on the we stuff. Either a sound scholarly consensus that the same person who wrote Luke and Acts. I think there is a sound scholarly position that most people think the same author. I think a lot of times people might argue over did the same author write the preface, but I think there's a scholar, Loveday Alexander, who argues that in a nutshell, and I don't want to straw man this, but they don't say that Luke was a physician, but he writes in a way that is parallel, similar to medical scientific literature and not historiographical. So it's not like this person is writing a historiographical piece of literature when he's writing the Gospels. And they point out like Galen and other examples to show prefaces that are like few sentence long, brief, boom, get right into it. And the reason a lot of people have thought that is that there's language about body parts and things like that that give the indication to some people that they think he's a physician. But he drops this like classical Greek style Greek in that preface 1 through 4 in Luke, and then goes into this biblical style Septuagintal, if I'm not mistaken, that's the term they use, like Septuagint style writing for the remainder of the text. So it sounds all sophisticated, and then it drops to like a Septuagintal language, but occasionally it'll drop some language that makes people think, oh, he knows some stuff about medical material. But it wasn't just doctors that knew how to write this way. And Loveday Alexander, if you're interested, has written books on this, actually. One of the books that she has is Acts in its Ancient. Actually, I have it right here. I brought it just in case we needed to cover some of this stuff. So let me back out of some of these things. I got all sorts of stuff open. The preface, that's it. The preface to Luke's Gospel, Literary Convention and Social Context, Luke 1:1 through 4 and Acts 1:1. And Loveday, of course, goes in and like points out all sorts of information to show the author is not writing a historiography. Like, they're just problems. Luke's preface and objective description. Anyway, but now I'm forgetting, did they write the same? Most scholars, I think, they think that the author wrote the same thing. That is not to say, though, that Acts and Luke have not tweaked over time. Whoever might have written something we would say proto-Luke, let's say, that Luke may have had adjustments, changes, especially going through the storm of the the heretics that heresiologists talk about, like Marcion and such. And there are scholars who talk about that. My script actually, in the end, actually covers one of those by Joseph B. Tyson briefly, because I didn't want to distract from the we passage stuff. It is, I don't know how many of you, I'd like to see a show of hands who've been online. How many of you in the comments here on this live have been online and have noticed the we passages in Luke are a huge deal? And it's like overwhelming to them that they say this guy was there. He writes in first person plural, we, our, us. And therefore, this guy's trustworthy. He's right there with Paul. So I'm kind of curious if you want to like drop a 1 in the comments or something to let me know if you've seen that online, because I see it all the time. And mind you, this is not a new idea. This goes back to Irenaeus, like the Muratorian fragments, like the two earliest that I know of are those two. And Irenaeus is arguing like, hey, Luke was a companion of Paul. And it's really odd. Really odd. I mean, I get why they do it, but there's a lot of interesting stuff here. So, yeah. Drop the like. Drop the like. Lucian Samosata is the author of Luke. Well, you'd have to show like concrete evidence, not an assumption. Like, hey, we could argue that, Justin Martyr's the author of Luke. I mean, we could say whoever we want to say, but if you don't have like definitive proof or good evidence, I don't want to just guess and throw out names. There's people who think, Josephus wrote Luke. We can throw around things, but unless you have like a really good case to make, I'm not just going to buy for anything like just all these guesses. I think Lucian has a lot to teach us about. Lucian Samosata's work on how to write history. I think Lucian has a lot to tell us about how historians should write, and Luke ain't doing that. Luke ain't doing that. In fact, let me see what page number on Loveday's book where she talks about, it's on page 30. All right, so we're going to go to page 30 together here, because Loveday actually brings up this problem. Scroll down here to page 30. She points out like this guy's not writing historiography as a historian. Preface, it's historical prefaces, page 30. I kind of took a few notes before I got on here. I wanted to kind of freestyle this, right? So, you've got here Polybius, Dionysius, Halicarnassus, all open with a reference to other historians, which also serves to alert the reader to the genre of the work in front of him or her. So you want to know what Luke's doing. Is he writing a history of what really happened? And what would have been considered too short, what he would have considered too short, Lucian does not tell us in so many words, though he did reckon it a fault to have no preface at all. But we may gain a more concrete idea on this from Quintilian. Let me zoom in so you could see better. All right. From Quintilian, who expresses the opinion that while prefaces must be brief, it would be ridiculous to follow the extreme example of those who restrict themselves to 4 sentences. And Quintilian, of course, the source says Quintilian is thinking of speeches which were naturally shorter and more concerned with brevity than histories. And there's more sources. Historians tended to err in the opposite direction. Thucydides, this has got to be a mind-numbing introduction. 23-chapter introduction is too long for the rhetorically formed taste of Dionysius of Halicarnassus. I guess probably in these sources he's complaining about it. Probably go, dude, 23 chapters in your introduction. But Thucydides was a gangster historian. So what do you expect, right? Dionysius's improved version takes about 3 pages. So 3 pages is still a lot compared to like a sentence or two, like in this brief, at most 4 sentence, like introduction. So this is interesting. In practice, we may gain a rough idea of the relative lengths of historical prefaces from a comparison of the text in a uniform edition. Thus, in the Tubner text, Herodotus's preface covers 3 pages. So you got 3. Thucydides 14. You can see like 6.5, 8, 13, 6, 5, 1. 9, 1.5, 3. It's they like historians back their stuff up. They really want you to believe what they're telling you is what happened. And they're very insistent on sources, mostly cautious. And the next thing you know, on the same page, you end up getting angels floating off into the sky, into heaven. I mean, that's a big red flag. If you ask me, that immediately angels are doing all sorts of magical stuff and there's all sorts of crazy things happening in the text, that I think a historian would be like, they say, or some believe. No. Luke wants you to believe the story, tradition that he is selling you. And so I rabbit trailed there, but I figure I just touch the preface, because in Bart Ehrman's forgery and counter forgery book, which we have here as well, pop that up. In this book here, he talks about the use of literary deceit in early Christian polemics. And you guys saw my recent video where I was up thinking about the deception in early Christianity. And I don't think a lot of these critical scholars are being, more critical of the material that maybe they're reading. And I'm not an expert. I could be wrong. I'm just throwing this out there to say, why are they buying the 7 and assuming Paul really was having visions? The 12 really did have a vision of Christ. 500 saw him, more than 500 saw them. Instead of trying to explain that phenomenon through natural causes, the sun, kind of like we do with when what is it, the miracle of the sun, where people see Mary, or various other natural explanations. While that's possible, that usually is the trend amongst critical scholars, is to explain this as if it happened in history in some way, but they mistakenly interpret the phenomena or something to that effect. I'm going to come back to me while I'm ranting here. They interpret let's say 1 Corinthians 15. They're reading, and he first appeared to so-and-so, Cephas, and then to the 12, and then to the other apostles and James, and then more than 500 brethren at one time, and then last of all to me. Now, my question is bro, you just wrote a massive, how long is this book? For Bart Ehrman's book, for example. Let me see. His book has, it probably isn't accurate. It's just 1,252, but there's no way there's 1,252 pages. Let me just scroll down here and see. That's, I want to say writings. I want to get out of the section where he's just prefacing stuff, letting you know, here's our index and all that. Oh my God, this is 1,200 and something, if you count the index and all. So this is the scholarly one. He wrote one called Forged, this more popular level. So dude, if you read this book, you are going to see how much myth making and fabrication is going on in Christian writings, forged letters. And I made the comment in my last video, but this is necessary. Christians are okay with recognizing this phenomenon, as long as this phenomenon is happening outside of the canon. Now, when I say Christians, let me be clear, apologist, okay? Because I know Christian scholars who are nope, Paul didn't write that. Nope, that's a lying eyewitness. That never happened. 2 Peter didn't write that. Nope, John was not really an eyewitness. Quit playing games. Matthew did not write Matthew's gospel. They're trying to get the tax collector to be the author of this book, and tradition starts to unfold. Nope, Mark was not writing down the sermons of Peter. Then why is Matthew borrowing from Peter or from Mark verbatim if Matthew was there? Makes zero sense why he would do there's all sorts of stuff, right? Christian academics will say, but apologists, no. They're going to war online and trying to show you, no, this is all true and it happened. So I started diving into the wee passages, and we might as well read what Bart Ehrman has to say and where this section is, because I read through the entire section and I thought to myself, holy smokes. If you take his approach, then there is we could call it pious deception, pious lie, but it's a lie. So I've got to find, where's the we passages? We passages. And I don't know if he has it in, actually, let me do this. Let me just scroll through and try to find it. Should have had the page number written down because I actually had to search this when I wrote my script. I didn't think, I'm going to get on this live stream and read Bart's section for everybody. This is the academic version, by the way. I think I mentioned that already, but the forged is much smaller and less footnotey and rigorous in terms of its approach. Forgeries in support of Paul and his authority. 1 Peter, 2 Peter. I imagine he's going to get there if he hasn't already. Where's the we passages, bruh? Bruh. Let me do it this way because it's harder through the website when I'm searching this book. Bart Ehrman. All right. Let me do it this way. We passages. Okay. Computer is trying to work its magic. All right. And by the way, while I'm searching for this, he catalogs, not even exhaustive, all sorts of Christian literature, apocrypha literature, clearly stuff that's not in the canon, stuff that is in the canon that's using this we, or even first person plural in the narrative, giving the impression that the author actually was there. And the Christian apologists are forced by the decisions made long ago by fathers in their tradition, what they can and cannot accept as scripture. And they reason from there, oh, that's not trustworthy. That's not trustworthy. That's not trustworthy. So you can tell that Christians were saying Peter says, right? Writing books in the name of Peter, Paul, James, all sorts of stuff like that. Yet, here we go. By far the most surprising aspect of the we passage, however. So we're in the we passage. There we go. Okay, page 477. So it's pretty far down there. We're almost there. And he takes this approach. If you take Bart's approach, you're forced to realize that they're lying to you. Okay? So it's a deception. It's a purposeful lie. The Acts of the Apostles. So he prefaces the we section just to give you a little back catalog. I disagree with Bart here on something but this is part of Bart's kind of argument, where Bart actually argues that the we passages that are later in Acts 16, they refer back to the preface where Luke is writing saying, or the author we call Luke, is writing saying I. So it's first person singular. I, I'm taking an account and going to give you this information, but then it gets to this first person plural in Acts 16, and he wants to connect those two as if the author's preface connects to this narrative literary function of we, and as if the author is saying they were present. But there's problems with that. Where are the we? And here we are, the we passages. All right, before we even embark on this, I got to check on everybody. Make sure your pulse is still running through your veins and see how the comments are going. All right, here we are. Scrolling up a little bit, trying to see everybody here. Dude, I'm trolling, Mandy. Okay. Thank you for letting me know that. Apologists are so frustrating. I'm sure they can be. And some are very much. I actually am friends with some. Derek, we want once again, Francesca Stavrogapoulou. Let me tell you, my friend, so do I. I've emailed, and I promise you I do too. But it looks like, and I keep my eye on the YouTube world, I haven't seen new anything by her. So, we've been blessed, if I may use the word, to have her presence, and hopefully in the future we will have her back again. I have been doing some emails just to keep you updated on scholars that I'm interviewing. And I'm actually going to have famous Roman classicist historians on Caesar, Augustus. I'm going to start tapping into a broad here. I thought I closed Facebook here. Okay. Sorry about that. I'm going to be broadening my interviews with many other scholars from different things, Assyriologists, Egyptologists, classicists, you name it. I want to really broaden my scope because we've been digging into the Bible for a long time, and I love learning about all of this stuff. So I'm going to take a page from Bill Donahue in his video state that the book is loaded with mythology, Greek mythology. I would just say mythology in general because it's all sorts of stuff. All sorts of stuff. Derek has an axe to grind. I just think, dude, let me be real. Yes, you could say it. For those who say, hey, dummy, it's right there. How do you not see it, right? I got my little Josephus out and ready to show you some fun stuff if we get the time. But if someone told you, like, you just aren't reading the words on a page, how do you not see it? It's so obvious that this is true. He's an eyewitness. It says we and us, first person plural in these narratives. But then all of a sudden it shifts back to third person. And you're like, and where it does that is like, no one who was there would have written this way. No one. Super sticker in the house. Someone gets some Hamagashima Baba. No, seriously, thank you so much for the super sticker. I just spoke in tongues for you. So I really appreciate the support. It's been a minute. Let's see. Jojo says the viewers can have PhDs on this, but you give the views of people with PhDs too, and you show them to laymen like us. I try to. I try to make this stuff like easier to understand. Why are you wearing a suit? Why are you, Mr. Pink, in your profile wearing a suit too? Actually, I got a few suits and I've been rocking them, just giving, I don't know, it feels good. Feels like I'm fresh, clean, in my ready to teach style, kind of gives me that feeling. Sometimes I'll rock the t-shirt and flex the tattoos that we've got, you know, the names on the arm and all that with family. But why not? Why not look clean? Why not look fresh and do that? Yes, we are, Anthony. We got James Apperson in the house as well. Decades, been a minute. Good to see you. Good to see you. Mr. Pink, of course, I'm being funny. But yeah, I'm just rocking the suit to do a video with you guys, honestly. Okay, we need to talk about this we stuff. So I'm going to minimize myself, pop Bart up, and probably do something like this. Does this look right? Which one's better? One, type one in the chat if this looks better for you. Or two, if I'm like hiding over the page numbers on the side there. What would you prefer? And while we get the vote, one or two, deconstruction zone in the hizzy. Can't stick around, but we'll watch back later. Keep keeping on, brother. Thank you, Justin, for showing love and support, man. It's been too long since I've done a stream. I got to get back into the rhythm of doing these because there is way too much that needs to be shown. A lot of apologists have really done some flexing just in the past 6 months. And I can't sit back any longer. I have to do some material because it's just, come on. You know, Justin, you understand, bro. Give me a call, man. Let's catch up. It's been a minute. I see you cooking too, man. I've been watching your lives. You've been doing a lot of those. I've been checking those out at night as long as my wife allows me to without her telling me to shut it off. All right. I didn't give a 1 vote, 2 votes. So we going with this? Or are we going with this? And I can hide the chat so we can see if that helps any. Let me see where we at on the comment section. Is there a way for me to hide the chat? How do you do that during this? They've updated like StreamYard so much since like I've been doing streams that even I'm like, how do you hide the chat anymore? It's not under the banners. It's not under the media assets. Comments? There we go, at the top of comments. Okay. So 1. This is 1. This is 1. Yes. I don't even know which one I chose. This is 1. Okay, let's just go through Bart, ladies and gentlemen. So Bart wants to connect the we passages and says this author is trying to give you the impression that they were there. All right. And if you will, we just scroll here. The 4 passages in question are Acts 16, 10 through 17. And then notice it jumps from Acts 16 all the way to Acts 20. Like the we, the us, the our, plural, it disappears at verse 17. No more first person plural. And then all of a sudden, boop, 3 chapters later, he's there in the story again. And you know what's really, really weird about that? Here's what's really, really weird about that. We gotta let you know, the apologists have such confidence. They want you to be so certain this is historical and reliable and trustworthy, right? Acts 16, Timothy joins Paul and Silas. That's another contradiction that we have a problem with, because Paul is going to Athens. And in Paul's own letters, Timothy is with him in Athens. Okay? Guess who's not with Paul in Athens in Acts? Timothy. He doesn't pop up so he leaves, of course, from Timothy and Silas, which Silas is not mentioned in his other letters, the 7 letters that scholars think are authentic. He leaves Timothy and Silas here. Let's see. Timothy lived, mother was Jewish, blah, blah, blah. He also circumcises him. Holy crap, man. Galatians 5 tells us Paul would have told them to castrate themselves. Paul would not have been like, yes, Timothy, circumcise yourself for the movement. All right, I'll make a Nazirite vow. His letters scream the opposite. He would not have been okay with this. But Acts likes to tame Paul, make him completely kosher, okay? So we're going through Acts 16. We go, the we passages start, if I'm not mistaken, double checking here, somewhere around 10. During the night vision, let me zoom in even more. Let's see if that helped. Did that help? Did I just screw you guys up here? Here we go. During the night, Paul had a vision of a man of Macedonia standing and begging him, come over to Macedonia and help us. After Paul had seen the vision, we, right? Guy shows up in the chat. He's like, yo, what's up? It's me, the author. I'm here. This is what early Irenaeus and other Christians, when they tried to like combat other apostolic authorities, and they're writing literature, I believe, propagandistically to bolster their theological groups. In some way, I can't imagine there's not something to this. That we, right, got ready at once to leave for Macedonia. This first person plural isn't showing up anywhere in Acts up to this point. And scholars go, what's going on? Oh, this is the companion named Luke who wrote this book. He just now decided to join Paul on his adventures. The very time he should have been documenting exactly what's happening, that Timothy wasn't with them in Athens, because Paul goes to Athens, but his letters say Timothy was with him in Athens. He doesn't show up till after he's gone from Athens. So it's already a contradiction, but you'll see that in my video that's going to come up. But we need to deal with these first person plural pronouns. We, right, got ready to leave for Macedonia, concluding that God had called us to preach the gospel to them. And if I were reading this in a modern letter, I'd be like, oh, so someone is talking and they're active participants in whatever they're writing. From Troas, we put out to sea and sailed straight for Samothrace or Samothraki, depending on how you want to pronounce that. Some people like to stick to that little instead of, the C. But I do want you to notice something before we continue with the first person plurals. Troas, okay? Dennis McDonald, Luke and Virgil, his book. I got to flex and do a self-promo here for this guy. He's an amazing, brilliant man. Does that mean everything that Dr. McDonald says is the gospel and true or correct or right? No. He's different than many scholars. He'll throw a ton of spaghetti at the wall. Some of it sticks, some of it doesn't. And if you asked him yourself, hey, do you think, all your ideas are true? He'll say, no, I don't. I do know that they practiced imitation, were inspired by Greco-Roman, Homer, Odyssey, and were competing with Virgil, which is a founding myth for Rome, and ultimately a founding myth that is propagandistic for the Julio-Claudian dynasty. The emperor, who in 9 BCE, someone had written a gospel inscription in stone, the Prian inscription, that the savior of the world was born. Caesar Augustus. So you already have a competition with the Roman imperial world with this Christ movement. And isn't it interesting that Luke's writing to a God lover named Theophilus, whether it's an individual, whether it's a group, whether it's a person who's paying for this writing, but it's likely a believer. He already loves God. So he's not a non-believer that he's trying to convert, but he's writing to his own groups. He's trying to preach to his own audience. And in all of Luke Acts, who looks bad? In all of Luke Acts, the Jews. And every single time that the Christians, the followers of Christ, are in trouble and the Romans come to arrest them, the Romans say they're innocent. They let them go. They're not guilty of these accusations that Christians are troublemakers. So there might be a memory behind this all that says Christians are troublemakers in society. They won't light candles to Caesar. They don't want to participate in the civic duties of the gods that are in these different regions under the Roman Empire. They're problematic and they're getting arrested, and who knows what else they did, because we mostly have all this data from Christians. When we do get someone to mention it, I think it's Tacitus talks about this pernicious superstition that is just this horrible illness, if you will. He looks at Christianity pretty rough, pretty harsh. But in Luke and Virgil, he documents that the very port that Virgil has Aeneas leave from, the very place that the adventures in the old Homer Odyssey, story of the Odyssey, is from Troy. The very region is Troas and Troy, okay? Luke has the very place where we shows up is the same place that you have Virgil's Aeneid have Aeneas, we taking off, first person plural in this epic. And if you read the Odyssey in book 8, the we starts showing up as they're leaving Troy. Well, let's go back for just a second and understand what the power of this geographic location could mean. From Troas, we put out to sea and sailed straight for Samothrace or Samothrace. And the end of Acts is all about getting to Rome. Paul must appear before Caesar. This is all as Richard Pervo says in his Hermeneutic commentary, this is a proto-Catholicizing book. It's trying to establish the church in Rome. And that's why Luke doesn't want them going back to Galilee. In fact, Luke wants them to stay in Jerusalem. They don't go back to Galilee, which contradicts Matthew and Mark. Okay? So we're back to the we's. I have to drop little nuggets along the way, though, because it's necessary. We have to keep in mind that the first time you're seeing these we passages, and I hope you're seeing what I'm seeing. Yeah, you are. We start to see you're in Troas. You got this already taking off in the port in the region where Troy was located. All right. That's neither here nor there for this point that I'm making about the first person plural. So goes on. We put out to sea and sailed straight for Samothrace. And the next day, we went on to Neapolis. From there, we traveled to Philippi, a Roman colony in the leading city of that district of Macedonia. And we stayed there several days. On the Sabbath, we went outside the city gate to the river where we expected. Okay, you get the we, right? We get the we. One of those listening was a woman from the city of Thyatira named Lydia, a dealer in purple cloth. She was a worshiper of God. The Lord opened her heart to respond to Paul's message. When the members of her household were baptized, she invited us, plural, us, to her home. If you consider me a believer in the Lord, she said, come and stay at my house. And she persuaded us. Cool. The writer is there. I would go so far as to say the author knows what they're doing. The reader is there. Okay. And once we were going to the place of prayer where we were met by a female slave who had a spirit by which she predicted the future. She earned a great deal of money for her owners by fortune telling. She followed Paul. This is the last time you're going to see this in this section. Paul and the rest of us, okay, shouting, these men are servants of the Most High God who are telling you the way to be saved. She kept this up for days. Finally, Paul, third person, right, which doesn't mean the we hasn't shifted yet, but watch this, became so annoyed that he turned around and said to the spirit, in the name of Jesus Christ, I command you to come out of her. At that moment, the spirit left her. When her owners realized that their hope of making money was gone, they seized Paul and Silas and us. What? I meant Paul. They seized Paul and Silas and all of us and me, right? And me? No. Well, hold on, dude. You were just there. Hold on. The writer was just there. We, us, our, we. dude, where did the guy go? He was just in the story telling us what happened because he's an eyewitness, right? He's right there with them. And then all of a sudden, he's telling the story how the owners who were pissed off that he like cast a demon out of the very person that made the money. So they go, oh, hell no, our money has been gone. Now our money was gone. They seized Paul and Silas and dragged them into the marketplace to face the authorities. They, third person, brought them before the magistrates and said, these men are Jews and are throwing our city into an uproar by advocating customs unlawful for us Romans to accept. Here we are, Romans. Romans don't accept these customs, right? Bad Christians. No. Notice the accusation even of Jews in this passage. And you'll notice there's always this conspiracy in Paul or in this story to make Jews evil and to make the Christians good. So notice they're being accused of bad things. But where did the first person plural go? And scholars note this, and Bart notes this in his book, and so do countless other critical scholars. This guy that was there is no longer there. He doesn't get seized. And anyone who's writing a first person narrative would have said something like, they seized Paul and Silas and I made an escape, or I slipped out from the crowd, or they barely didn't get me as I fled. No exit, no explanation, nothing. The dude disappears into thin air. This writer is no longer there. In the present, he's floating above like a god, and he sees everything that's happening and writing the narrative like an omniscient narrator, because he was never there to begin with, ladies and gentlemen. This is the deception. And even if, let's say Bart Ehrman was mistaken, that the author's not intending to be an eyewitness present, the Christians like Irenaeus and the Muratorian fragments and the tradition that ends up rolling out that tries to make him one creates a deception. Because now modern apologists are just repeating an old thing where they go, well, he must have been there. And when you get to these passages where it's like, dude, why didn't the we stay in the text? How come he's no longer there? And there's zero explanation for it. Every explanation you have is eisegesis. They love to use those exegetical. It's exegesis or eisegesis. You're inserting crap into the text that's not there to make sense of it. You're making up stuff to try to make this plausible or believable. And I hear apologists do this all the time. And it doesn't stop with this passage. For 3 chapters, practically, the we guy's not there. And guess who he pops up again? 3 chapters later, he pops back up. And you go, what? And when he narrates in we format, he knows things that you would have to be God to know. Even especially when you get to the shipwreck stuff. Like, how did he know how many people were on board the ship? Was he the sailor? Did he build the boat? Was he the one who was the expert sailor? I thought he was the physician, you guys said. Because he writes in medical terminology, or at least uses medical terminology, which Loveday says doesn't demand that someone is a physician. There are others who do that as well. But like, let me come back to me here. I'm actually in this, okay? I'm not poofing away here. But this is a big problem because this guy knows so much geography and whatnot. And I was speaking to Steve Mason on the phone for hours the other day talking about this because we did a script that's going to be a 3-hour video. Again, in advance, I apologize for those who have a 60-second attention span and live on TikTok 24/7. I apologize that we cannot condense 3 hours of historical critical information on how Luke Acts borrowed from Josephus into 60 seconds. I could give you bullet points if you want to walk away with that, but it doesn't make the case. It doesn't make a solid case to convince and persuade so that people can see it and go, my goodness, this is absolutely borrowing from Josephus. And Steve Mason used to take a much softer approach in his 2 books. So he wrote his first book somewhere in the 90s, I think the late 90s or early 2000s. Let me double check that. Josephus in the New Testament. If you don't have it, it's a fun, easy read, especially the first version of it. But he has added material to this. 1992. So this has been a throwback, right? And this is a powerful book. And when he wrote it, it wasn't a writing of saying, I'm going to prove Luke Acts borrowed from Josephus. He wanted to ultimately cover the topic of this guy, Josephus, because that's who he's an expert of. He knows Josephus. I love this guy. The updated version adds more. It's a second edition. Love the coins. I'm big into that. Looks really cool. Cool material. Anyway, he wrote that one in 2003. So practically a decade later, I think. Yeah, practically 11 years later. And he updated it. Well, since then, Steve Mason has refined and even gone further in thinking there's actually more stuff there, but to make a solid, provable case, convincing even the most critical minds within his field, he has covered that. But there's more material that if you see what he has shown to be the evidence that Luke Acts is using Josephus, there's more stuff in Luke Acts that makes better sense now that you know that. And one that I found, and I got to give myself a little pat on the back here. I'm actually proud as a non-PhD, just an avid enthusiast who loves studying this stuff. People have been encouraging me, go get your PhD, man. People will take you so much more serious. What are they going to say? I mean, you're at that point, you've wrote your dissertation. You're skilled and an expert in a particular area. And I'm like, dude, the amount of time that would take for me to do that, I wouldn't be able to keep doing this, which helps me to pay and feed my family. Like it literally does. This is what I do full time. But like, I would love to get my PhD and be able to go, dude, cut it out. Like I'm not some conspiracy theorist. I'm a bona fide expert in the field here. But I recognized an interesting fact that I must share with you. And I'm going to pull up my script here. I'm going to pull up something that even Steve Mason was like, I never noticed that. And he did, I guess I sent him on a rabbit trail on the TLG. So there's like Greek lexicons and stuff. He was going in and trying to find this. And here it is. So Luke, we're talking about Luke, right? Luke Acts. This is an interesting thing. I say what I suggest isn't incompatible with Robbins, which is another scholar that talks about first person plural narratives of we, us, our, those kind of pronouns are used in sea journeys, sea voyages a lot. Okay. Now, if Robbins was suggesting this was absolutely universal, well, we can find counter examples of third person narratives on sea voyages, which means they, them, he, or name the character, whatever. It's a pretty common thing, and I document that in the script. But I say Mark calls it a sea. Let me zoom into this thing here. So Mark calls that very lake we call the Sea of Galilee, right? It's the Sea of Gennesaret. Matthew calls it a sea. And John calls it a sea, but he doesn't use Gennesaret. He calls it the Sea of Tiberias, and he used another term. But Luke, who's borrowing from Mark and Matthew, calls it a lake. Oh, switched it up here. He calls it a lake. That's odd. So why would Luke change the language of that lake that was called a sea? Mark 1:16, Mark 4:35, Mark 6:48. It's Thalassa or Thalassa. The name is sea in Greek. Gospel of Matthew, always sea. Here's your references, right? You can pause it, and my documentary will go through this kind of material for people. John, always sea, and you can see the Sea of Galilee or Sea of Tiberias. The Gospel of Luke calls it Lake Gennesaret. He changes it from sea to limne, Limne. You can see it every time. So not once does Luke call Galilee a sea. And if you go and actually read Mark and Matthew, which their language is verbatim practically in some cases, they're talking about the land of Gennesaret, the land. Luke specifically identifies the body of water as a lake, but then they do use sea for that body of water that's near the land of Gennesaret. Well, I said, hold on, this is weird. So I went and looked in Josephus. Josephus always calls that body of water a lake, never a sea. And the region is also, the region of land that's around that is also Gennesaret. So he goes, this is an oddity I've never noticed, but it looks like Luke may, I'm not being overly certain about this, Luke may be actually using the language from Josephus over the tradition of Mark, Matthew, and maybe a few scholars think, Luke knows John, but mostly it's easier for people to think Mark and Matthew. He chooses to say, nope, not a sea, lake. He only reserves the sea for the journeys with Paul in Acts. So he only keeps the sea there. And Robbins thinks a little theological when he interprets this. And this is a bit of theology, so it's not as provable, or the case isn't as strong, but you can see his thinking. And that is, the sea represents the nations. So, in Revelation, there will be no more sea. There's this common reference that waters and sea represents the nations of the earth. And what is Paul's mission if it isn't to go and, save the nations? He's called to the Gentiles, to the nations. And that could be the case, right? I say that my calling this out is not incompatible, but the fact that Luke chooses that same geographic identification for that body of water and disagrees with using his earlier tradition of Mark and Matthew is an oddity. And even Mason said, well, it's not a absolute proof. Maybe Luke was trying to be a little more accurate and called it what it is, because that's what Josephus calls it. And that's what Strabo calls it, is a lake, the lake of Gennesaret. It does at least say there's that chance that if Luke is borrowing from Josephus, he's also using the language to correct this earlier tradition that's saying it's a sea. I just said, whoa. He said, I never found that before. That's cool. We hung out and talked about it for a while. All right. Coming to the chat for a minute here, making sure everybody is okay. Doc Pleroma, none. I haven't seen a lot of you guys. And Luke uses Josephus like a lazy student uses Cliff Notes to write a paper on Hemingway. Look, dude, it's funny you say that, because I have the very section that is identified with this. And why? First of all, I got to address this. Fam. I mean, we got to talk about this. Scholars, Josephine scholars, and it's not just Mason, Steve Mason here. They hypothesize that the reason that Luke Acts got it wrong, got what wrong? Apologists watching, pay attention. If you've heard this before, you just want to keep running with, they must have a common source or Josephus borrowed from Acts. If you think that, stay tuned. Don't worry. I've got a 3-hour video that's going to rip this in half. But Luke Acts is clearly borrowing from Josephus. And what's really odd is in this section, which is Antiquities, Book 20, Chapter 5, and I actually think I have Josephus on here. It'd be useless in showing it without actually giving you guys visuals. Here we are. Okay, this is better. Can everybody see that? I hope everybody could see this here. Press 1 in the chat right now if you can see this and everything is clear and you guys hear me and everything's okay. I want to see ones, pretty please, just so I know that YouTube is cooking good and we're good. We don't have any problems. All right, let me zoom in a little more. Someone says they can't see. There, I think that's the max I can go without it, taking it off the page. All right. Ones. Someone's evil with the 6. You little evil scoundrel. Oh, 666, Mandy, you horrible, evil little demonic devil. All right. Chapter 5, concerning Theudas and the sons of Judas the Galilean. I thought this was cool. All right. I've got my highlights. Just want to make sure I'm not having to read all of this because there's a lot of information here. But now it came to pass, while Thaddeus was procurator of Judea, that a certain magician, whose name was Theudas. All right. That's important. So we have this guy named Theudas, right? Persuaded a great part of the people to take their effects with them and follow him to the river Jordan. For he told them he was a prophet, and that he would by his own command divide the river and afford them an easy passage over it. And many were deluded by his words. However, Faddus did not permit them to make any advantage of wild attempt, but sent a troop of horsemen out against them, who falling upon them unexpectedly slew many of them and took many of them alive. They also took Theudas alive and cut off his head and carried it to Jerusalem. This was what befell the Jews in the time of Cuspius Faddus's government. Now you have a time statement, okay? You know how to anchor this because Cuspius Faddus, his government was in 44 CE. What's really, really odd about this event, this happened. Dude, this is so problematic. On many levels, this is so problematic for the super bona fide historical Luke that everyone knows gets all his facts correct, ladies and gentlemen. Just go watch Jonathan McClatchy or one of the apologists, and they will make sure you understand how accurate and how true. Duh, he's copying a lot of stuff from a historian, but even that he gets wrong, right? So where's the Gamaliel speech? Isn't it Acts 5 or 6, if I'm not mistaken? Ananias and Sapphira, apostles hail many. Hold up. Judas, here it is. Here it is. Here it is. Here it is. Take notes, ladies and gentlemen. Clip this crap. I don't care. Send this to your mom and dad. It's fine. Let's see. The apostles were brought in and made to appear before the Sanhedrin to be questioned by the high priest. We gave you strict orders not to teach in this name, he said. Yet you have filled Jerusalem with your teaching and are determined to make us guilty of this man's blood. And that's kind of funny because one of the other gospels talks about, let his blood be upon us and our children. I kind of wonder. Who knows? Peter and the other apostles replied, we must obey God rather than human beings. The God of our ancestors raised Jesus from the dead, whom you killed by hanging him on a cross. God exalted him to the right hand as Prince and Savior, that he might bring Israel to repentance and forgive their sins. We are witness of these things, and so is the Holy Spirit, whom God has given to those who obey him. When they heard this, they were furious and wanted to put them to death. Notice how the Jews want to kill him for simply believing in Jesus and like saying, hey, the Jews want to kill him. Terrible, terrible, right? Okay. But a Pharisee named Gamaliel, a teacher of the law who was honored by all the people, stood up in the Sanhedrin and ordered that the men be put outside for a little while. Then he addressed the Sanhedrin, men of Israel, consider carefully what you intend to do to these men. Some time ago, Theudas appeared, claiming to be somebody, and about 400 men rallied to him. He was killed, all his followers were dispersed, and it all came to nothing. After him, Judas the Galilean appeared in the days of the census and led a band of people in revolt. Well, we got a problem here, and there's two big ones that stick out. Number one, Gamaliel, the teacher of the law, this guy was saying this speech in the 30s. According to the book of Acts, this guy is talking in the 30s. Ladies and gentlemen, Josephus says that Theudas was killed, beheaded, under Cuspius Faddus's government in 44 CE. How did Gamaliel know about the death of this man named Theudas, who carried men out there and, 400 men rallied to him and he was killed and his followers were dispersed a decade before it actually happened? Okay, this is called roasting apologetics. Literally, it's right here in front of your eyes. Cuspius Faddus is in 44 CE. Unless the author is living after these events, writing in the mouth of Gamaliel, there's no way Gamaliel is writing about a historical event like this. It's not even like he prophesied. It's not like he said, brethren, in a decade from now, a man named Theudas will lead a revolt. No, or lead men out. None of that. He acts like it already happened. But Gamaliel is talking in the 30s. The second problem. Here's the second problem. It says after Theudas and his people were killed, right? Important. Very important. He says he was killed, all his followers were dispersed, and it all came to nothing. After him, Judas the Galilean appeared in the days of the census. Well, how the hell can Judas the Galilean appear after Theudas when Judas the Galilean was running his cleansing of the temple and his revolt for the whole taxation issue in 6 BCE. This guy is not after Theudas, he's before. So scholars look at Josephus, and guess what? They pretty much come to the conclusion. Here you have in Josephus, in chronological order, Theudas is killed, right? Under the Cuspian Fatus's government. Cuspius's. Okay. Then came Tiberius Alexander as successor of Fatus. He was the son of Alexander the Alabarch of Alexandria, which Alexander was a principal person among all the contemporaries, both for his family and wealth. He was more eminent for his piety, and this his son Alexander, for he did not continue in the religion of his country. Under these procurators, that great famine happened in Judea, in which Queen Helena bought corn in Egypt at a great expense and distributed it to those that were in want, as I have related already. Now, look at this. Remember now, up here, Theudas, right? Then it goes, and besides this, the sons of Judas of Galilee were now slain. I mean of that Judas who caused the people to revolt when Cyrenius came to take an account of the estates of the Jews, and as we have shown in a foregoing book. Now notice the chronology. Some scholars conjecture, and conjecture rightly, I mean, I think there's something to this. Theudas, this prophet up here, gets killed. After that, you get this Judas of Galilee mentioned, but it's his sons who are now slain. So the argument goes that they're already contradicting a timeline that makes no sense in Gamaliel's mouth by having Theudas die a decade after Gamaliel could even make this speech. But then after Theudas dies, it says right here, after him, Judas the Galilean appeared in the days of the census and led a band. It's not after, it's decades before this guy. Can't be after. He too was killed and all his followers were scattered. Therefore, in the present case, I advise you leave these men alone. Let them go. For if their purpose or activity is of human origin, it will fail. But if it is from God, you will not be able to stop these men. You will only find yourselves fighting against God. Theomakoi in Greek, which is well known. If you go looking back into Greek literature, get your TLG out and you'll find this. In Theogony, Hesiod's Theogony, go back to Aeschylus, go back to all of these plays. I mean, I know that Manny Marhal his ears are tickling right now. Euripides, all of them. Dionysus cult was persecuted. They were actually persecuted in history and even outlawed at certain times in Rome. But they were persecuted, and the very Greek term theomakoi, God fighters, is applied here in Acts. Now, that's a side note, but it's worth checking out just to have an understanding. Luke Acts, I think, is engaging with the Greco-Roman world a lot. I got a book in the other room that actually is from a Christian scholar who recognizes this. But that's a problem, ladies and gentlemen. That's a problem in and of itself. That's not even dealing with the we stuff we were talking about. So I just did an entire rabbit trail because Doc Pleuromenot just sent me off the rails. I think my greatest sin is I will run down a rabbit trail hardcore. Will I not? Let's see. Eleazar says scholars have their presuppositions by which they preclude contrary data. So therefore what? We can't read the text for ourselves and recognize the problem that we just read together. I'm just teasing here, but I don't know what you're trying to draw. Well, I mean, everybody has bias, if that's your point. Everyone has them, and it's okay. Everyone does. But it's kind of interesting. I can't imagine a more humble dude than Steve Mason when he actually is explaining this stuff. He's like, dude, I did not anticipate this. I'm getting hot as hell in this suit. Not going to lie, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to pop this thing off. Hopefully my lighting doesn't get all weird, because when you're wearing all white, sometimes it'll make the lighting different. Okay, it's fine. Whew, I can breathe. All right. Everybody, did you see what just happened there? Well, you have to trim the history to fit homily. Did everybody see that? Myth Vision is such a liar. I'm such a liar. Everybody's read that together. What did I lie about? Help me out there. Where am I wrong? Where did I make my boo-boos? I'm happy to be corrected on this. But I know that, like, dude, this is part of the YouTube world. I got friends who start YouTube channels and they're like, yeah, and I'm excited. I can't wait to get a couple positive comments. And then they have some like person who just can't stand them come in and comment. And then they like really lose it. They're like, what the hell? Even recently, I have to explain, you have to kind of get a thicker skin. But recently, I did my video discussing why I even made that video, responding about my exchange with what's his name, Jay Dyer. And my God, if you mention his name 3 times, like Beetlejuice, he appears in the mirror through 18,000 goons, and they've commented for 2 years, like endlessly, like, you got cooked on there by this guy using tag on you and stuff. And I'm like, okay, I'll finally address this funny little exchange because, yeah, I did. I think so, at least. I didn't have a good performance at all in that discussion. But it was just like, you got to have thicker skin when people are going to be upset by this shit, right? And I just think it's personally pretty wild how you can like rip religion a new asshole, but if you bring up politics, whoo, man, you can say whatever you want about Jesus, no problem. But you start talking about that, whoo, you're gonna get in trouble. Flame so hot he had to take his jacket off. That's right. Alex, thank you so much for the love. I really appreciate it. So this is the stuff that William, you've been here for a long time, man. When I see this kind of stuff, I think to myself, like, what do you mean? Gamaliel equals Seneca. I mean, look, I've done some parallelomania in my life, right? In my days. And then some of this stuff, though, just makes me wonder, what evidence do you honestly have to make, these kind of connections? I'm being honest, okay? I'm trying to be respectful here, but I see it all the time, and it's not you. There's a consistent theme of people who will comment things that just don't seem to have a rigorous method on trying to see where the dots might connect. Some stuff is going to be a little bit fluffy. Ancient history, we've lost most of our sources from the past, but I just wish we were a little more cautious. That's all. Oh, I see what you're saying. They met in Niagara region. So yeah. There's Paul and Seneca, but these are like the later epistles. But I'm thinking Gamaliel. So I'm kind of wondering, maybe I'm misunderstanding you. Maybe that's what you're trying to refer to here, as later letters forged in the name of Paul and Seneca. As I see it, Christianity is just a public domain label that many rival ideological cookie factories produce under. They all advertise as God's favorite cookie and original recipe, etc. I appreciate that, man. Thanks for being here, brother. Okay. So let's go back to Bart. Let's do it. And let's scroll down. There's 4 passages, by the way. We could go through all of them and show you in chapter 20, 5 to 15. And you'll notice awkward situations that you're like, where's the we at? Why does the we disappear like that without any? And so I had to flee and run away to a faraway land. But later Paul tells me, no, there's nothing of the sort. And how we just blindly buy this is beyond me. So he goes on, right? He tries to connect it to the eye. He thinks that he's writing deceptively, even if you want to call it pious deception. But then he goes to various solutions. The author of Acts was a companion of Paul. He covers some of the contradictions there. The author used a source for these passages. This has been an old view, used to be that Paul was using an itinerary, someone else's journal, to write these narratives. And that's why he has we come in and out of nowhere. But the whole reason scholars thought that was because of the first person plural, the we. So it makes no sense. Scholars have drawn the conclusion pretty much. It makes zero sense that the language in the we passages is consistent all the way through Acts. This author writes the same style, syntax, and everything. The whole reason they came up with this hypothesis was that the we's popped up. But then it's self-contradictory, because if they're going to use that, you would have thought the author would have then tamed those we's out of this journal to craft in the third person, in which he was doing all along. So this has been out of favor. Scholars do not buy this this itinerary. Oh, he had some companion's notes, and so he incorporated those notes into Luke Acts. The language is the same. It doesn't make any sense. So he goes through that. Then he goes through the use of first person plural accounts in narrative sea travel, and he really quickly dismisses Vernon Robbins. And while I know that there are other third person narratives of sea voyages by his, critics like Susan Prater and of course John Ruhlman, and I mentioned this in my documentary, that does not disqualify that there is a common trope where when you're on a boat, third person plurals and third person singulars take place. And if you go back and read Vernon's actual work instead of just getting what's going on by Bart, because Bart just quotes two of the people who are critics of this view, you really need to read By Land. It's free, by the way. By Land and By Sea, The Wee Passages and Ancient Sea Voyages, Vernon K. Robbins. And he goes through and he documents all sorts of accounts, starting way back with Gilgamesh and Egyptian stories where they're first person singular. The first time that we have any historical evidence of a writing of any sort where a first person plural shows up in a boat voyage is Homer. Homer, the very place that Dennis MacDonald is trying to tell people, ladies and gentlemen, look to the Greek epic. Look to the Greek epic, because in order to learn Greek in this period, you had to learn Homer. Homer is how they taught Greek, and people would have known Homer. They would have known these stories. So why is it he's leaving from the port in Troas at the very beginning of the Wee Passages? I don't know. Maybe Dennis MacDonald is onto something, and we shouldn't be so dismissive of him. Anyway, he goes on. You can tell there's a lot here. Well, look at how much time Bart spends on this. This is how much he writes in his scholarly account, right? The use of first person plural. This. Oh. To that. And that's it. Up to the author is making a false claim to have been an eyewitness. So he literally, it was very quickly in and out, boom, dismissed, name dropped a few scholars, don't agree with it. I'm moving on. And I'm sorry. I think there's something more to what Vernon is arguing here. And that is not to argue there's a universal, everyone must use third person plural when they're doing voyages on ships. But when you actually look carefully at Luke Acts, you're going to notice the we's pop up when they get in a boat. And you're going to notice that soon after they get on land, it almost always drifts back to third person. Why does it go to we on boats and then they get into the land and then all of a sudden it starts going back to third person? Vernon is identifying something interesting here. Maybe there's something to it. Meaning you don't have to buy every detail, every jot and tittle of what a scholar might suggest, and yet still see some value in what's happening here and what Vernon might be identifying. So I recommend that. You can pause this later. You can come back and reference this video. My documentary is going to actually elaborate on this, and it's hopefully going to be enjoyable. So for a lot of people who aren't hanging out in long live streams and they want that little nice professional quality looking video, that's coming, and it's going to really break this stuff down visually for people to go, oh my God, something's happening. This is the fun part for Bart. The author is making a false claim to have been an eyewitness. This is at least playing in the sandbox with the Christians, because the Christians are claiming this is an eyewitness, ladies and gentlemen. We, us, our, we, then it pops back to they, which, dude, makes very little sense. Why did he vanish? He should have been arrested with them. Or in the other cases, here he is in the upper room and he's some guy falls out of the tower or a third story window because he's fallen asleep to Paul's witnessing. I don't know if that's a jab at Paul or if they're just writing a funny story. Paul's putting people to sleep. Maybe his preaching wasn't so good. Okay, kidding. Maybe I'm not. But this is the examples that he goes through, starting with John. John, as we know that his testimony is true. His, third person, right? But it's we know, okay? And we know that his testimony is true. This is the epilogue of John. Many scholars think John 21 was added to John. Many. Maybe not all, but John 20 ends. Like it has a perfectly fine ending. Then someone tacks this chapter on to chapter 21, and there's so many different scholarly visions on what that means and why. I'm not even going to waste my time today on that. And we know that his testimony is true. The author differentiates himself, as is not always recognized, from the beloved disciple. So notice, whoever wrote John 21 is not the beloved disciple whose testimony is supposedly being written. It's supposed to be the beloved eyewitness guy who's there writing this. And we know his testimony is true. That's odd. So I like how Bart's like really examining this closely. From the beloved disciple to imply a personal acquaintance with him and his testimony, and to provide a firsthand assurance of the accuracy of his testimony. So whoever wrote this couldn't have been the beloved disciple. So it must have been some other eyewitness who was there. You know, that's what those usually do. 1 Corinthians 15:8, and he goes through 2 Corinthians 12:2. 2 Peter is a well-known one. We did not follow cleverly devised myths. We heard his voice from heaven, for we were with him on the holy mountain, and we have the prophetic word made more sure. The author, falsely claiming to be Peter, uses a first-person plural narrative to place himself with other apostles in the presence of Jesus at the crucial moment of the transfiguration in order to validate his own message and to denigrate the message of his opponents, who were not eyewitnesses. We, right? So there's those we's. And I think, of course, this is first person. Paul's writing here. Paul is writing here. He goes through other examples. What I find really cool about this is he goes outside the canon. Gospel of Peter, right away. Gospel of Peter. When Christians read we in Luke Acts, they go, dude. They're talking about Quirinius. That's a real dude. Dude, they mentioned Theudas. That was a real dude. Dude, they mentioned Judas the Galilean. They mentioned Agrippa. They mentioned Bernice. They mentioned various other leaders and the Caesar. They're mentioning all these people that are historical. They mentioned geography. Oh my God, these are real places. Which, by the way, Homer actually documents, even though it's an epic and we call it a fiction, Homer, every place that Homer goes to is a real geography. It's not fictive. They're real places. Characters may be made up, but maybe some of them are memories that go back in orality to some person, and they've inserted them into these stories. But this is easier to show because you got Josephus. So it's like, okay, yeah, real people are showing up, and they're like so persuaded by the we's because they're like, oh, we were there. Oh, yeah. And then they get sucked into the church because of the preaching of their pastor, and they believe in it, and they're drinking the Kool-Aid. But then all of a sudden, you get to this example that I have on screen. Gospel of Peter, 26:59-60. But I and my companions were grieving and went into hiding, wounded in heart. For we were being sought out by them as if we were evildoers who wanted to burn the temple. Peter, the Gospel of Peter. This is not in the canon. This happened, dude. Dude, this is real. A real guy's writing it. He says, I and we. While these things were happening, we fasted and sat mourning and weeping night and day until the Sabbath. But we, the 12 disciples of the Lord, wept and grieved, and each one returned to his home, grieving for what had happened. But I, Simon Peter, my God, the author is Peter. It's called the Gospel of Peter, and it says, I, Simon Peter, and my brother Andrew. Peter wrote this, ladies and gentlemen. Why don't you believe he wrote this? It says I and we. What the heck? What I'm trying to get at is there's so much of this that he documents in this. The Greek apocalypse of Peter, Passum. The Coptic apocalypse of Peter. The Savior said to me, Peter. Peter's writing this, ladies and gentlemen. The Apocryphon of John. The Apocryphon of James. And many others in the Nag Hammadi library, right? They're doing the same things for similar reasons. Irenaeus to Florinus, quoted by Eusebius, which he uses as a real example of somebody who claims they know Polycarp and blah, 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 blah. Proto-Evangelium Jacobi. Pseudo-Matthew. I, James, son of Joseph the carpenter. The Apostolic Constitutions 1.1 in Passum. These are, and look, this is kind of interesting. Like the apostle and elders to all those who from among the Gentiles have believed in the Lord Jesus Christ. When we went forth among the Gentiles to preach the word of life, we, the 12, assembled together at Jerusalem. This is the disciple. Oh, the 12 are there doing this. They're making a constitution. I, Philip, make this constitution. I, Bartholomew, make this constitution. I, Thomas, make this constitution. Ladies and gentlemen, they're all writing this together. They're all there making this together, present. Why aren't we believing this? The martyrdom of Polycarp. I mean, and he goes on. Martyrdom of Ignatius, martyrdom of Miriam and James. And he just goes on to point out in some of these scattered examples, the first person narratives is in the singular, in others, the plural. In some instances, it dominates from the beginning to end, Coptic Apocalypse of Peter. In others, the first person appears after an initial third person narration, Proto-Evangelium Apocryphon of John. And yet others, the first person disappears into the third person narration, Infancy Thomas. In a number of cases, the first person is not identified, but is anonymous. Like John 1:21 and 1 John 1, martyrdom of Polycarp, martyrdom of Miriam and James. And Luke's gospel, ladies and gentlemen, is anonymous. They put the name Luke in there after time, and that's important. Okay, look, I can go on, but I wanted to say this last part of Bart. Make sure I've touched everything just briefly, and I want to play for you a recording I did with Hugo Mendez that has never been public. I might edit it and put it out there just to polish it up a little because it was such a fun, quick chat. But he says at the end, except that the author of Luke was not a personal companion of Paul who participated in his journeys, his claim to have been a companion is false. This then is a book making a false authorial claim. It is, in other words, a forgery. Luke's gospel is a forgery. Luke and Virgil, ladies and gentlemen, if you're interested, you can go there and find his section on we passages. I just skipped over all of that. Euripides, Bacchae, Virgil's Aeneid, Iliad. I think it's in this section somewhere. This is Dennis's book, Luke and Virgil, but he covers this in other places as well. Paul's shipwreck, that's freaking one of the important ones. Trojans survived the shipwreck. I cover this in the script that's coming up. I'm going to show you that. Fascinating material to consider. Anyway, he goes through all sorts of stuff there. Again, we did that one. We have Josephus, which slaps Luke in the face on this whole literal, like Luke's not the getting facts as accurate as these apologists would like to pretend. And like, what kind of excuse do they have for a lot of that stuff? So the one thing I want to show before I go is Hugo, but I want to look at the chat first to make sure I do show all of you some love. So I'm coming back to me. Hugo Mendez, by the way, is an expert on John's gospel, and he worked in the office with Bart Ehrman, and now Bart's retired. So Hugo is filling in the space where Bart Ehrman once sat, which is interesting. That's cool to know. I know Roku. That's what I'm saying, bro. Like, that's what I've been saying. Like, dude, this blew my mind. I knew the Gnostic Gospels were all true. They were there too. And they come on, man. We know that this is fact. You know what I'm saying? Golly, a little too docetic for canon, but the Gospel of Peter should have made the greatest canon hits. Absolutely. Absolutely. And the Apocalypse of Peter. Come on, the tour of hell and heaven. I think that's so funny that in the Apocalypse of Peter, that author's ethics, his morals for God being a good God, I think they peek their head out because hell and this idea of eternal punishment that some Christians seem to have, it was not universal, peeks its head out there. And in the Apocalypse of Peter, there's this idea that if you're a friend with a Christian or you know a Christian and that Christian is in heaven, but you're in hell, that Christian can pray to God and get you out of hell into heaven. But you got to have Christian friends. You got to know Christians in order to get out of hell and be put into heaven. Now, that's pretty wild when you think about it. I think it's funny. But it's just interesting to see that Christians have like the get out of jail free card literally in the Apocalypse of Peter. Let's see. Trusted Living. Good to see you here. God gave me great disabilities. Hey, that's not contradictory. Both can be true. Let me see. Hold up. I'm in the midst of some debate or some argument. I don't know. Trying to see any chats, any comments, anybody before I end up going. Atheists provide no reason. I think a quick history lesson is due here. And a shameless plug real quick. Let me do a shameless plug first. I am going to go to mvp-courses.com. Okay. Let me help our friend here in the chat, ladies and gentlemen. My God, we need to cast this demon out. This isn't right. I mean, it's just watching someone like this be possessed like that. We really need to help them. So together we can do that. And so I have a few exorcists here that can actually, I hear they do a really, really good job of exorcising the demon of ignorance out of people. It's the name of a real demon, and it causes people to remain ignorant, and you want them to be educated, right? So there's a scholar who just so happens to not be an atheist. In fact, far from being an atheist, he's actually a Christian, and he goes over the history of the quest for the historical Jesus, but it's not really about like trying to find the real Jesus. It's really the quest of historical scholarship. And you ought to thank the Protestants, the Christian Protestants, for all that we have today as far as the real critical, bona fide scholarship that we find. You literally need that, because the Christians are the ones who actually, based on this not only the scholar, but historically, are the ones who taught us, showed us the problems with these materials. Hold on. Nielsen Lex calling me real quick. So sorry. Yo, bro, I'm on a live. Yep. All right, bye. So if you want to learn from a Christian, since atheists have they atheists suck. You know what I'm saying? We don't know what they're talking about. Like, come on. I know this already. Why are you going to throw that? It's kind of like an insult. You threw it in my face. Like, of course I know I have no reasons. Duh. But this guy here, he has reasons. And he shows you the history. And he shows you how Christians were the ones who actually gave us all this critical scholarship. And you would be actually quite shocked if that demon was willing to leave, that it was the Christian academics who started highlighting many of these problems that I just said today. And in fact, if you weren't there at the beginning of this live stream, my friend, I actually addressed this issue at the beginning, and I said, just so you know, nothing I'm going to say as far as the scholarship is concerned today, nothing I'm going to say is anything different from what a critical scholar will say that is a Christian. They will call out Luke. They will say he made boo-boos. He's wrong about Luke Acts. They will say the we passages are not eyewitness. They will show you that John's gospel is not an eyewitness. They will show you that 2 Peter is a forgery and a liar in terms of being deceptive and is not an eyewitness. Now, they may not use the term liar. They might prefer a softer form, pious fraud, or a white fib. Okay, if you have a different synonym that you would like to call your particular term, that's fine. But if you're not telling me the truth, I would just say you're probably being dishonest, or you don't know and therefore you're ignorant. So I think we can all collectively probably just raise our hands and speak in tongues and cast the demon. I hope it leaves. Let me know if it leaves, ladies and gentlemen. And oh my God, the demon just got stronger. Damn it. The demon just got stronger, dude. Fam, how do we help DNA? Please explain with what we're talking about with Bible, scripture, with text, with Luke Acts, with we passages, with what we just did. What does DNA have anything to do? That demon, damn it. We need to do something. Can someone get a real exorcist in here? We need help. We need help. Satan is in here trying to stop us from actually being successful. This is not okay. This is not okay. Yes, a Christian friend to get out of hell, you're done. Get out of hell free card. Yes. Yeah. I don't mind. No. You guys booted him? I didn't want you to boot him. It's kind of entertaining. No, look. I was joking. I was like, I'm being funny. It's just having fun. Okay. But seriously, if you just saw everything I talked about, which has nothing to do with science, has nothing to do with any of that, and then you start talking about DNA, bro, like I can't even like, like, you know, can you imagine how flustered? Imagine I've been on here an hour and a half. Imagine if my whole comment section I had just not even paid attention to, and I come back and it's all like, yeah, well, show me transitional fossils. And I'm like, bro, what does Luke, Acts, and Josephus have to do with transitional fossils? Other than he transitioned Josephus's material in a horrific fashion into his own literary creation. Honestly, probably thinking that his audience would not be in the know. And that's actually one of the things Mason implies. Steve Mason, who's an expert on Josephus, thinks that Luke is dropping stuff to look like he knows so much. He's dropping names and they serve no narrative function. Many of these things are like, they have no function in the narrative whatsoever. And he's borrowing from Josephus. It's like, dude, what? But you start talking about transitional fossils and DNA being code and, you know, and the earth was created 6,000 years ago. Derek, damn it. What's that got to do with anything that I just said in here? Anyway. All right. Enough of me being distracted and having fun. I actually have fun with that kind of stuff. So just, oh, okay. I'm thinking, bro, it makes sense now. Look at your name, DNA. But I'm thinking to myself, I'm addressing you, bro. Like, I'm the one addressing this guy. And he prefers to argue with you instead of me. That's not fair. Oh, my God. Anyway. I guess somebody actually did exercise them. So what do you do with that? All right. Does everybody vote? I got to have a vote here. Does everybody want to see this little non-edited, unpolished version of my discussion with our good friend here, Hugo Mendez? If you're down, say yes. Type out yes. Say yes, I want to see Hugo Mendez deal with this issue. Or no, I don't want to see Hugo Mendez, who's an expert on John, explain why John is not an eyewitness. Yes? No. Yes? No. Yes? No. Oh, we got a lot of yeses here. We got to let I fish in a tie. Why? Why, man? Why? James was killed for refusing to renounce Jesus. He was the most trusted person in Jerusalem. You are a joke. My God. Let me find out the exact passage in Josephus, because let's see what Josephus says. What is the exact source in Josephus where James is killed and why? And the reason why I ask this question, since I'm a joke, and you've come in the chat several times in the past, and I know that you're a fan of the same scholar that I'm an absolute fan of, James Tabor, is this. You make a claim that James was killed for refusing to renounce Jesus. We know that Josephus talks about the death of James. Can you tell me why he was killed in Josephus? Where does it say he would not renounce Jesus in Josephus? Where does it say James was killed because he would not recant or refuse to renounce Jesus? Please comment that down below. Because I'm actually talking to Steve Mason, who's a Josephine expert on this. We've discussed this. And nowhere in Josephus does he say why he was killed for renouncing Jesus. Yeah, please cite your source. Cite your source, my friend. Since I'm a joke, don't be the joke here. You come in and you like to jab at me all the time, right? And we're both fans of a great scholar, James Tabor. So I don't know what your beef is with me, but let's see the source. Show me the source where it says he would not renounce Jesus, so they killed him. I'm waiting. Well, show me the source. What are you talking about? You talking about in Acts? You talking about this story in Acts where James dies? Okay, let's go to the story in Acts. Let's go to Acts. So Acts 12. We're going to pull up Acts 12 together. Because it's a very hyper-specific claim that you're making here. All right. Hyper-specific because apologists make it all the time. And they say, dude, those people who are persecuted, they wouldn't recant. They believe Jesus died on the cross and rose again and stuff like that, right? So let's see. What verses are we dealing with here? 1 and 2 says, it was about that time that King Herod arrested some who belonged to the church, intending to persecute them. He had James, the brother of John, put to death with a sword. When he saw that this met with approval among the Jews, he proceeded to seize Peter also. This happening during the festival of unleavened bread. After arresting him, he put him in prison, handing him over to be guarded by the 4 squads of 4 guards or 4 soldiers each. Herod intended to bring him out for public trial after the Passover. So Peter was kept in prison, but the church was earnestly praying for God for him. Looking for James, looking for where he wouldn't recant. Help me out, man. Give me your source, because I'll be happy to be corrected on. I'll be happy to correct whatever source you have. Help me out, man. I want the proof. I want the evidence. I will be happy. I will be happy to be proven wrong. I will right now be like, dude, I fish in the tide. You were right, man. Like, he would not renounce Jesus, and they killed him for it. Not, like Paul and Thecla, or like some of these Pauline legends where he says, like, don't sleep with your husband. Because, there was a lot of ascetic thought. So they painted Paul in such an ascetic way where he was telling women in the cult, don't sleep with their husbands. And then the law came and stepped in because some of these very rich people were tired of their women not wanting to sleep with them. And so they had him decapitated. Not renouncing Jesus, but because the guy caused problems in people's bedrooms between their spouses. Like, he wasn't killed for that. It just was odd. Like, you can maybe go to Stephen and say, okay, Stephen was stoned to death in Acts. And in that case, he just kept on and on about Jesus, and they didn't want to hear about it, so they murdered him. But of course, Acts is painting a narrative where the Jews are all evil, like Jews are bad. Over and over and over, the Jews are at fault. And in fact, historically, Christians have persecuted and attacked Jews throughout history because of narratives like Acts that paint these kind of views. So I would like a primary source. Wrong James. It is Hegesippus. Okay, I asked for the source, not just the name, but I'd like the actual source and what that source exactly says, that says he wouldn't renounce Jesus, so they killed him. Now, if you're talking about they would light a candle to Caesar or whatever, all this kind of stuff, I need to read that source because it's been a while since I've read Hegesippus. But I don't understand why you would ignore Josephus. Doesn't say that he did this. They killed him for that. They say he was a breaker of the law. How's the passage go in Josephus? Let me see. Josephus says something like, after the death of Procurator Festus, and when Albinus was on his way from Rome, the high priest Ananus, son of Ananus, took advantage of the interval. He convened the Sanhedrin and brought before it James, the brother of Jesus, who is called Christ, and certain others. He accused them of breaking the law and delivered them to be stoned. So he's a lawbreaker in Josephus. So you found a source, Hegesippus. Let's see how old Hegesippus' source is. I'd like to know, when was Hegesippus written? Just to get a rough idea, because I'm sure scholars debate that. Let's see. Roughly near the end of the 2nd century. So you got a 1st century account that says he was a lawbreaker, never says he renounced Christ. Then you go to a 2nd century source. So give me that exact source. Stoning is because of blasphemy. So where, like, I'd like the text to be like, he wouldn't renounce Christ, so we killed him. You know what I mean? Because blasphemy can mean many things, and it doesn't just mean, oh, you claim to be God. That's something we also know that is important. Anyway, I just figure I'd let everybody know. When you make this, you jumped in several times, and you're also a fan of the same scholar that I am, but you call me a joke. And I don't know if that's because you're some evangelical who, like, is stuck with the biblical narrative. And I just literally showed you contradictions between Luke, Acts, and Josephus, and this book also borrowed from Josephus. I don't get it. I don't understand. All right, let's go check out this video together, ladies and gentlemen, because I think that is going to help people understand Hugo, who's an expert on Paul, what he has to say. And I'm just going to be hanging out, checking out the chat. So feel free to comment. Here we go. All right. Okay. Edit this in. This is raw to the script that we're doing as introduction for these gospels. And here we go. 3, 2, 1. Dr. Hugo Mendez, I am doing a project currently on eyewitness testimony in the New Testament, specifically the Gospels and Acts, which I'm going to dive into. And it's going to be a series. So you are participating here. And the question I have would be, how did the name John become, the gospel according to John? Many people say this is an eyewitness account. They will do everything they can in their apologetics to give that position. And I don't want to attribute motive in a negative way. But even early Christians seem to do this. So modern apologists are just repeating an old idea. What do you say as a scholar, and how did his name end up at the front of the gospel?
Yeah, sure. So the reason why ancient Christians thought that this was an eyewitness text is because the text says it's an eyewitness text. Right at the beginning of the text, in chapter 1, verse 14, the author places himself among the people that Jesus lived and walked and ministered through. After Jesus becomes flesh, the word becomes flesh. The author says, we have seen his glory. He's one of those people. He hints at the same idea in 1935. He seems to identify himself with this character in the book that's called, mysteriously, the disciple whom Jesus loved. We're never given the character's name, but we are given the impression that this is a super close disciple of Jesus, part of his inner circle. And then the kicker, in the end of the gospel, in chapter 21, verses 24 to 25, the text explicitly says that this disciple, the disciple whom Jesus loved, is the one who testifies to these things and has written them. And we know that his testimony is true, kind of a thing. And so that's why people believed it was an eyewitness text, because the text said it was an eyewitness text. And the text said that it was actually the work of a disciple of Jesus. Now, the text isn't an eyewitness work. It's not.
Why is that so? If you don't mind addressing, why would, it says it, right?
It says it.
So, and this is the problem I'm having, the hurdle I'm going to be dealing with in this series is that, well, it says that, but is there contrary evidence or evidence that is ignored on why that is? Or is it a common trope to attribute eyewitness to a material that you're trying to kind of pawn off as eyewitness, but it may not be eyewitness?
Yeah. So part of the problem is with, if you will, the testimony of this eyewitness. The Gospel of John contains all sorts of speeches for Jesus, in which Jesus talks about the need to abide or dwell in him, how he will abide and dwell in his disciples. He will talk about the need to be born from above or born again. He will speak about this new life as spirit that his disciples can gain that will help them become children of the light. It's an entire constellation of phrases, idioms, terms that are unlike anything that we find in the other Gospels. If Jesus cared about these ideas as often as this eyewitness, supposedly author, says that he cared about speaking and teaching about these things, you'd have to ask the question, how is it that Mark, Matthew, and Luke, how is it, frankly, that Paul totally missed these particular phrases, idioms, expressions of Jesus? It's more than that, though. The gospel contains all sorts of stories, accounts of the life of Jesus. And these accounts are things, the raising of Lazarus, right? The turning water into wine, these very distinct miracles that we don't find a trace of in the other gospels, that, by the way, also seem to have a kind of hidden symbolism tied to the gospel's theology. When you combine dubious speeches for Jesus with dubious narrative accounts, stories of his life, you have reasons for at least questioning the testimony. But it's not just the testimony that's a problem. The testifier is the problem as well. Again, the gospel claims that it's written by this eyewitness disciple. The issue is that there's no trace of this disciple in the other gospels. In chapter 20 of the Gospel of John, Jesus is risen from the dead. The disciples hear a rumor of this. And according to the Gospel of John, Peter and the disciple whom Jesus loved run to the tomb of Jesus. If you go to Luke, there's a story where Peter runs to the tomb alone. There's no other disciple with him. This disciple keeps getting inserted into scenes. In Mark, Matthew, and Luke, you hear how Jesus had a Last Supper with his disciples. In the Gospel of John, this character is suddenly there where he wasn't in the other texts. So this way that this author, this disciple, keeps showing up in texts, where we don't expect him to be, where we don't hear him attested elsewhere, find him attested elsewhere, at least adds a little more.
Hey, just so we're on the same page, I fish in the tide, did a little research here. Yeah, Hegesippus it's a legendary account. Clearly does not depict what happened in history. Very, very important that, people understand that this contradicts what is being described in Josephus. And Christians wrote several legends of martyrdoms on how people died. And this is at least 100 years later, late 2nd into the 3rd century, that this guy's even writing this material pertaining to James. But yeah, Hegesippus does seem to imply that James is going to be thrown off the temple, which means he's somehow aware of Josephus, but he's contradicting this in creating a legend about James. Just thought I'd say that. And yes, Hugo is a Catholic, period. Hugo is a Catholic. Super, very critical scholar. Yet he's a Catholic. Again, so for those atheist people who want to say atheists are wrong and all that kind of stuff, or they can't listen to an atheist, I'm sitting here on screen listening to a man who has faith, but is a scholar and is absolutely saying John is not an eyewitness, is on board with saying Luke Acts is an eyewitness, Matthew, Mark are an eyewitness. They don't buy in any of that at all. And they probably obviously agree with me that Hegesippus is not historically accurate in James's death, that he would not renounce Jesus.
More suspicion to him. And then you get to the fact that this author is actually a highly idealized character. The disciple whom Jesus loved is really unusual from the other disciples of Jesus in John. In John, all the disciples of Jesus abandon him at the end of his life, but not this disciple. He keeps staying with Jesus all the way to the cross. He doesn't leave Jesus' side. During his interrogations, he's present. He's present always. At the Last Supper, he reclines on Jesus. He's so close to Jesus that he's literally lying down on top of Jesus, and Jesus welcomes that. Everything about this character is framed in idealized terms. When this disciple runs to the tomb and he enters into the tomb, the very first thing the text says is that he believes once he enters the tomb, where Peter, where Thomas in the rest of the chapter are all confused or doubtful. So you combine this testimony that's really kind of problematic here in terms of the speeches of Jesus, very much unlike the other gospels. The narrative materials are unlike other gospels. And then you compound that with doubts about the actual witness, the actual testifier. And that's the reason why fundamentally there are great reasons to doubt that this really is an eyewitness text.
So it's important, though, as an ancient early Christian reader of this material, why they would attribute John is they're reading it at face value. They're trusting. They're not like questioning, oh, let's doubt it. He said he's an eyewitness. Well, let's question all of that. No. It's almost like they accept it. They're probably part of the community in which this was a really popular gospel. And they're saying, hey, well, who would he be? And then therefore, why would this name be tacked on? You kind of were mentioning this before. Can you elaborate a little bit more on how would we identify this beloved disciple? How would an ancient Christian do that? And then why would they put the kata according to, Evangelion of John,
Sorry, I just lost my microphone for some reason. One sec. Witness text. Yeah, so the earliest Christians are reading this text that claims to be an eyewitness text. And although, you can imagine that some of them might have been skeptical, a lot of them weren't. They liked the book. Just like many modern readers today will pick up this book and not think twice about whether or not they should trust it, whether they should actually believe that it was written by an eyewitness. The question, though, is who is this eyewitness author? this mysterious disciple whom Jesus loved. Again, the text keeps him nameless. And so what almost certainly happens right from the very beginning, as today, is that readers are intensely interested in the question, who is this disciple? Who should we identify him with? Now, there are some obvious options, roughly. A reader of this text who sees that this disciple is present with Jesus at the Last Supper would know from the Gospels of Mark, Matthew, and Luke that it's the 12 disciples who are at the Last Supper. So it's got to be one of the 12, right? But it's even more than that. Everything about the book suggests that this mysterious eyewitness author, if he really existed, is supposed to be in the inner circle of Jesus, like literally the closest disciple to Jesus. In the Last Supper, there's this amazing scene where, again, the disciple is reclining on Jesus. Jesus and him are just right together like this. Peter's a little farther off. Peter, the primary disciple, according to Mark and Matthew, is like a little ways away. And Peter wants to ask Jesus a question. And according to the Gospel of John, he has to ask the beloved disciple to ask Jesus his question. Like he has to go through this disciple. So if you're an ancient reader of Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John, and you're trying to figure out who this author of John is, you're probably going back to the Synoptic Gospels for at least ideas. You think he's one of the 12. He's got to be the inner circle of Jesus, someone who could even rival Peter. Well, the Synoptic Gospels tell you that among the 12 disciples of Jesus, there are 3 disciples that were the closest disciples to Jesus: Peter, James, and John. When Jesus is on the Mount of Transfiguration in Mark, Matthew, and Luke, he takes Peter, James, and John with him. When he's in the Garden of Gethsemane in the Synoptic Gospels, he takes Peter, James, and John with him.
Closer. Yeah, because the rest of them are at a distance, then he brings them closer. Yet none of them can stay awake. They all fall asleep, which we're going to bring this out in the series about the omniscient narrator, because it's like, who heard the prayer? But anyway, please continue.
Yeah. So you figure if this is like the closest disciple to Jesus, it's got to be one of those 3 disciples. So which one is it? Peter, James, or John? Well, the beloved disciple and Peter appear together in scenes. Remember, they both run to the tomb together. So it can't be Peter. That leaves James and John. Which of the 2? It's a nice coin flip. If you want to push the odds a little further, though, you might remember that in the book of Acts, in chapter 12, you're told very early on that James died only a couple years after Jesus. He's supposed to be really the first of the 12 who dies, who's killed for his faith as a martyr. So that means the only one of those 3 who's not Peter and who had a long, lengthy career to write something like a gospel would seem to be John. It takes exactly about 15 minutes, if not 15 seconds, for someone to do that math and to say, I guess it's John, and kind of do that number. Now, is it actually John? Scholars don't think so. Today, contemporary scholars are almost united in the proposition that this can't be John the son of Zebedee for various reasons. We know a lot about John the son of Zebedee from the Gospels of Mark, Matthew, and Luke. We know, for instance, that John the son of Zebedee was a Galilean fisherman that Jesus called one day when he was fishing with his brother and his father. And this is a figure that, you read in the Synoptic Gospels, went on the Mount of Transfiguration with Jesus, was in the Garden of Gethsemane with him, tried to be all this sort of stuff. Well, when you look at the Gospel of John, none of those stories that involve John the son of Zebedee as an important character appear. Not a single one in the Gospel of John. There is no call story. There is no transfiguration. There is no Garden of Gethsemane. It's really unusual that a text that would be based on the supposed eyewitness memory of a character would happen to exclude all the actual stories he was present for that are the most important stories in those Gospels. But it's even more than that. Again, he's a Galilean fisherman. Now, if you turn to John chapter 18, verse 15, you'll see that the Gospel of John says that this disciple, this other disciple, which in chapter 20, verse 2, will be directly identified as the disciple whom Jesus loved, who travels around.
By the way, this interview, which is only 14 minutes in out of 47, was supposed to only be like a 10, 15-minute recording. And then, I even text Hugo the other night on the phone. I'm like, hey, man, you got 3 minutes to chat? I'll just make it short. 3 minutes. He calls me. He's like, hey, Derek. And I'm like, look, at 3 minutes, because I already know how we get. I said, hey, dude, I am going to literally say it's been 3 minutes. And I did. And I was like, it's been 3 minutes. You got time? Oh, I got time. We went on for 25, 30 more minutes. We have a hoot. There's a lot there to learn and to unpack. What's going on here? You said, what is even going on in this video? I'm asking him why the name John was added to the Gospel of John. And how did early Christians come to the conclusion that John, the beloved disciple, and you might even say, some will say the elder, of course, because you can get to the epistles that say this is an elder named John, would have become the name they attributed to this gospel. By the way, there were 2 Johns in Papias that are also mentioned as well. Such great information. We are DNA. Yes, thank you so much. Appreciate the love. If the BD were John, son of Zebedee, beloved disciple, why never name him while naming minor figures? Good question. I mean, like this is something that I think is an important question that you would think, why not just name the man? What was the point of constantly calling him just that instead of giving some clue as to who it was? But you can see why deductive reasoning would lead to the conclusion of why it wasn't Peter, because the beloved and him are racing to the tomb. That rules out Peter. And in the finals episode where, do you love me? Feed my sheep. Do you love me? Feed my sheep 3 times. Peter and the beloved are there. So it's either James or this John. And so if it's James, well, he just points out, and I think he already did, or if he isn't, he's going to, in Acts chapter 12, James, that brother of Jesus, is seen as being killed. Or the James that is this one, that is the 3 that come with him to the top of the mountain. So it may not be his brother, but James, John, and Peter. They're the 3 on the Mount of Transfiguration. That James dies in Acts 12, soon after Jesus. You know what I mean? Not very long after Jesus does he die. So now you have Peter, which is ruled out, James that seems to be ruled out, and you got this beloved who's lingering around, and there's this saying that he will not die until Jesus comes. But Jesus did not say that. So it's this weird passage. The other thing is let's see, where's our buddy? The Thai guy. Let me see, where's he at? He asked me a question earlier. I fish in a tie. I fish in a tie while fake news. Let me see. Why was he stoned? Blasphemy. And what I was doing for that moment was to sit there and check in antiquities. So you're asking, why was the James that was the brother of Jesus, who was called the Christ in Josephus, killed? Was supposedly he broke some law, right? Josephus Antiquities 2199. I'm in 199 though is what I need to get to. And let me see what 199 says here. And now Caesar, upon hearing the death of Festus, sent Albinus into Judea as procurator. Albinus seems to be a problem, but the king deprived Joseph of the high priesthood and bestowed the succession to that dignity on the son of Ananus. Sorry, it's Ananus that seems to be the problem. Who was also himself called Ananus. Now the report goes that this eldest Ananus proved a most fortunate man, for he had 5 sons who had also performed the office of a high priest to God, and who had himself enjoyed that dignity a long time formerly, which had never happened to any other high priest. But this younger Ananus, who, as we have told you already, took the high priesthood, was a bold man in his temper and very insolent. So Ananus is the problem here. He's too angry and quick to his temper. He was also of the sect of the Sadducees, who are very rigid in judging offenders above all the rest of the Jews, as we have already observed. When therefore Ananus was of this disposition, he thought he had now a proper opportunity to exercise his authority. Festus was now dead, and Albinus was but upon the road. So he assembled the Sanhedrin of judges and brought before them the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, whose name was James, and some others, or some of his companions, and that's in brackets, by the way, or some of his companions. So I'm not sure if that's even in the original Greek there. And when he had formed an accusation against them as breakers of the law, he delivered them to be stoned. But as for those who seemed to the most equitable of the citizens, and such as were the most uneasy as at the breach of the laws, they disliked what was done. They also sent to the king Agrippa, desiring him to send to Ananus that he should act so no more. So breaking the law, well, there's a lot of reasons, if you go and look at Jewish law, why someone would be killed. Just thought I'd make that note. This is the same family that got Jesus crucified, by the way. So we don't, he says he broke the law. We don't have, he wouldn't have renounced Christ. Like, that's not in that text at all. And it doesn't even imply that. It just means that he was seen as a lawbreaker amongst the Jews. And there are many reasons there. Now, if you want to go to Hegesippus, go ahead. Yeah, look, Doc Plum was right. You need to parallel the account with Hegesippus and the Pseudo-Clementines to create an amalgam story. But Josephus doesn't say that. And legends build over time. And 100 years after Josephus writing stuff like that, when Paul has milk after getting decapitated, he has milk coming out of his neck. I mean, the fantastic that they start to do and the way they rework their stories of martyrdom and such. I have no reason to think that Hegesippus is telling the bona fide fact of what happened. I just don't. So, not true. There were not many reasons to be stoned. Under blasphemy, there are more than one reason to be. Blasphemy is not, oh, I think a man is God. That's not like the only reason to blasphemy is not the only reason. So then we'd be having a debate all day about this stuff. I'm going to play a little bit more of this.
Around with Peter, this figure, it says, was close friends with the high priest in Jerusalem. How does a Galilean fisherman, someone from the backwater of that region of the Levant, Palestine, right? Mm-hmm. How is that figure who's doing a lower class profession, who is not someone we would expect to be at all well-connected, literate, friends with the high priest in Jerusalem, like literally the most important Jewish figure of his day? That doesn't make sense for John the son of Zebedee. By the way, we can take it one more step. If this is a Galilean fisherman, then you have to ask the question, how does he write a sophisticated Greek text, not his native language of Aramaic? We know that Jesus and his disciples apparently are speaking Aramaic. They're even called out for their accents, their Galilean accents by people in Jerusalem. They're very much from that region speaking that native language. How is he writing a fine work of Greek narrative prose that's tying in all sorts of philosophical knowledge, that's doing things that are quasi-Philonic and understanding Jesus as the logos that existed before all time? It doesn't fit what we know about John the son of Zebedee. But again, saying that this text was written by John the son of Zebedee is not a hard conclusion to come to if you just happen to bracket out that data and at least just think about the question of who's the closest disciple to Jesus. I think it took minutes, if not seconds, for some group of ancient Christians to arrive at the speculation that it might have been John the son of Zebedee. And then they would have encountered the fact that there are really no other good options out there because this figure didn't exist, because there are no other rival candidates to be this figure. And so you have some group, maybe a couple groups of ancient Christians, a couple readers, circles who have been reading this gospel saying, maybe it's John. Eventually, all that happens is, in the absence of a better idea, that becomes the interpretation, especially when a few well-placed voices start to pick up this idea. When you get the Irenaeus's, the Clement of Alexandria's say it's John, based on what they've heard, that's what sticks.
Yeah. Man, okay, I'm going to shift into another question, but look, I'm jumping back and forth. I hope everybody who's interested in seeing why John was not an eyewitness, why John did not write that gospel, and clearly it's a false eyewitness claim that is in that text. Hugo Mendez is the man. I'm going to make this polished, of course, and actually launch this. But again, bouncing here, we're about to get to another question because I'm going to push on further. But I just want to say to I Fish Natai, who says, not true. There were many reasons to be stoned. In fact, according to Leviticus, the only reason that is in the Bible is a man curses the name Yahweh. That's the only reason to stone one, biblically speaking, Leviticus 24. However, there's idolatry, which includes false prophecy. And we know that Jesus and his disciples and those after him were prophesying, claiming to be prophets. Paul claimed to be a prophet. So here they could simply have been false prophets making prophecy. And this priest says, hey, this leader within the group says, no, you are blaspheming. You are committing a crime against God. And we know rabbinic sources do back that up. It doesn't mean he had to have somehow, I won't renounce Jesus. Whoop, throw him over the corner of the temple. Oh, off the precipice, boom, he dies, or at least he's injured. Then they go down there and they throw stones to finish him. You have to build that over time. So you've got idolatry. You could violate sacred areas, temple restrictions. That would be considered blasphemy. Sabbath violation was also considered a form of blasphemy by many rabbinic sources that are later commentated. Sorcery and magic, sedition or leading the people astray could be treated as a capital offense and breaking the law. It doesn't even say it's blasphemy. It says it's a law that he breaks. He's a lawbreaker in Josephus. So you really need to get Josephus right. Now, if you want to die on the hill of Hegesippus a whole 100 years after Josephus, be my guest. But Josephus says he's a lawbreaker. And that could be all sorts of stuff. There's sedition, of course, as I said. blasphemy by insulting the temple or law. Like there were different ways. There were different ways. So believing in a messianic claimant is not blasphemy. It's just not. So that's not been ever something that we've seen that they've said is blasphemy. Anyway, continuing. I'm jumping back and forth. Let's keep going. Where did I put it? Here it is. Wow, there is so much here. So in light of that, Irenaeus and the anti-heresiologists, if you will, it almost helps them, it seems, to have this apostolic kind of pedigree, and they're using John likely in later debates to support their kind of view in terms of that's the gospel that they are accepting as theirs, that's apostolic. Would you say there is some of that debate later?
Yeah, I mean, Irenaeus, Clement, figures like that, they're not disinterested parties in this debate. They want an apostolic John to do the kind of work that...
Hold on. I Fish in the Tie bought one of our courses, right? Which we sell, which James Tabor, of course, did a lecture recently on about early Christianity. I would love for you to email me, since you're one of the course people who purchased one of our courses. Show me where James says the reason that he was killed in Josephus or any of those accounts there that are specifically saying he won't renounce Jesus. You get this in Hegesippus, but he's a lawbreaker in Josephus. So if you want to say, well, the scholar mentions Hegesippus, that's fine. And if you think that there's something to that Hegesippus is correct, there's a lot of scholarship out there that points out this is a later legend building upon the James stuff. So I'm sorry, but there's scholars who have all sorts of different ideas, and I'm just pushing back to point out that Josephus never says nothing like that. Acts doesn't talk about that. You go to 180s, 190s, and come to the position that's what I'm saying.
They want the Gospel of John.
And by the way, I filmed the whole thing. I sat there and filmed the entire exchange. I'm the one behind the camera who filmed that course. So I was present for all 10 lectures.
To do for their theology because of the longstanding now acceptance of the Gospel of John in the kinds of circles they've run in. Yeah, they're very open to the apostolic authorship of John. And it's not just them. Lots of Gnostic groups, Valentinians we know are interested in this particular identification. It seems the Sethians have picked this up. It seems a lot of ancient Christians held this particular view. They did it again because they liked its ideas. They're reading a text that claims to be by an eyewitness, and they're just trying to figure out which eyewitness it is, and John seems to be the only candidate they can think of.
So now we need to just quickly go into the letters of John, first, second, and third. The first one doesn't name anyone. It doesn't give an attribution to anybody. 2 and 3 says, the elder. It talks about an elder, which is like, huh? And so I've already mentioned in this video so far that Dennis MacDonald is of the opinion, and probably along with certain academics, that whoever wrote John's gospel, and he takes a strategic or a stratification model for John where this is in layers, whereas most modern scholars would suggest, sorry, this is actually probably one composition, and there's an explanation, kind of like how Goodacre might explain doublets in a different way than a Q guy, right? So you have another explanation. You just reverse it and say, no, John's gospel likely came first. What's going on with 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John? And then maybe even why tack on the apocalypse? Other scholars think this 5-book canon, if you will, may have been a primitive canon prior to what we later get. But what is your thoughts about 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, and then maybe how did John in the apocalypse relate to this?
Yeah, so I explore this in depth in my new book, The Epistles of John, Origins, Authorship, Purpose, with Cambridge University Press. So the letters of 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John are also anonymous like the gospel. By the way, the gospel speaks in a we, I voice. So do those letters. By the way, the gospel claims to be written by an eyewitness. If you look right at the beginning of 1 John, the author of 1 John says that we have seen, we have heard, we have touched Jesus. These texts are actually inhabiting the very identity, the very persona of the gospel's author. What I've argued in print is that what we call 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John are texts that were written by other authors reading the gospel, who, looking at the gospel, liked this book and thought, I wish it addressed this issue, or I wish it addressed that issue. And they decided to do what so many ancient Christians did around the end of the 1st, beginning of the 2nd century, which is write a text under a false name or persona. In this case, it's a false persona, not a name. They keep the anonymity of the Gospel of John, but they write in the persona of that author books that do other sorts of things theologically, practically. And that's what we're seeing in those texts. They are together a chain of pseudepigrapha, of falsely authored works.
Wow.
So the reason why they end up sharing the same name as the Gospel of John is because they were meant to look like they were works by the same author that wrote the gospel. So the scribe who is looking at different gospels and deciding that, okay, so this one has to be the gospel according to John, then looks at these other letters, or another scribe looks at these other letters and says, well, this is the first letter of John, the second letter of John, and identifies them with the same figure.
So it's really simple. I wondered if there was any relation with the elder that we know Papias is mentioning. There's this John the Elder, and maybe an early tradition that kind of conflates, John the Apostle from John the Elder, and then they kind of made a way to make it make sense, kind of like you said earlier about who's the best candidate here with the gospel. But it seems maybe it's just more likely linguistic affinities, theological affinities, light versus darkness, dualism, different things that are there. It's easier for an author probably to just say, well, we've already attributed this to John. So it's easier to just connect the dots to 1, 2nd, and 3rd John. Is that probably more likely to you?
Yeah, in that 2nd John, whoever writes 2nd John clearly is trying to look like the author of 1st John. If you walk through 2nd John, go from about verse 4 to verse 7, you will find line after line verbatim similarities to 1st John, like places where the author word for word is copying the text of 1st John. So this is a text that also inhabits a we I voice. This is a text that actually directly copies the language of 1st John, that intervenes in the same kind of debates as 1st John and takes the same position as 1st John. It was the most natural thing in the world for ancient Christian readers to recognize this as a text that seems to have been written by the author of 1st John, because I think that's what its author actually wanted. The difference is 2nd John is written in a standard letter form where you have to start off with, like Paul to the church at Corinth, the Corinthians, right? You got to do the who's it from and who's it going to. And so this author, looking at an anonymous Gospel of John and an anonymous first letter of John, needs to put something down there. And he decided to use, apparently, the elder, this kind of like the presbyter. We know that Papias is describing the apostles of Jesus as the elders. We know that in the Petrine epistles, the voice of Peter is claiming to be an elder, a presbyter. I think it was just a very easy title for an author looking for a term that keeps anonymity to just slap on the text. But every scribe subsequently, Christians for thousands of years, understood roughly what that author was going for. He was going for the claim that this is the same author of 1st John and John. Now, separately, you've raised the question of Papias and how Papias factors into this tradition and the traditions about John the Elder. So here's what I have to say about Papias. We don't have a lot of Papias. We have Eusebius writing in the 4th century telling us that Papias is this figure from the 2nd century who's written these 5 volumes, an exposition of the sayings of the Lord, and scholars are all over the map about what that book possibly contained. Eusebius gives us just a few fragments, a few tiny quotations from that work. Steve Carlson, a scholar in Australia, has done an incredible job really trying to, find how many quotations do we really have of Papias through the centuries. And his list is actually astonishingly small of the ones that really and truly seem to be quotations from that original work. The problem we have with Papias is that because we are missing so much of that work, we don't know how to interpret the material we have. So for instance, Papias, right in what appears to be his introduction, according to Eusebius, as he's describing the sources he used, he mentions the name John twice among the sources of the sources he consulted in writing the work. The problem is scholars debate to this day whether the 1st John is the same as that 2nd John. They're both listed as elders. One of them, for some scholars, gets called John the Apostle, and the other one gets called John the Elder. This is like a scholarly inference based on the fact that there are 2 Johns there. Other scholars, though, think they're just the same person. It seems that Irenaeus read Papias and understood these 2 to be the same person. Maybe he was right, maybe he was wrong. Eusebius said he was wrong. Irenaeus apparently thought he was right. You can't tell without the original book in question. There are even kind of other issues that we have with Papias. Papias, from those small quotations that we still have from Eusebius and other writers, is someone who opines on a few different issues. He opines on the origins of the Gospels, right? This is why, for instance, apologists really love these tiny, tiny, often very confusing quotations. The problem is this. The material that we have from Papias, what little survives, does make some definitive claims. It tells us about the origins of the Gospel. It tells us about the death of Judas. It tells us about other traditions of Jesus. Every single one of those traditions that Papias gives us that we could confirm as modern scholars, we would disconfirm as modern scholars. So let me give you an example. Papias tells you how Judas died. He tells you that Papias was cursed by, Judas was cursed. Okay,
I love this part.
Papias tells you that Judas was cursed by God and that he essentially became the blueberry of Willy Wonka, right? Like Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, where Judas suddenly blows up to this massive size. And it's very grotesque and ugly, apparently. And according to Papias, one day Judas is walking through a city gate, and he's so big that even a gate that's big enough for a chariot, he can't make it through. And as he's stuck in the gate, a chariot runs him over and splurts him all out. He's dead. Now,
Right.
we have traditions of how Judas died. We have one in Matthew, and we have one in Acts. Both stories that, by the way, the apologists would be far more willing to give credence to. Both of those stories tell how Judas died. Both of them, by the way, disagree with each other. Both of them absolutely disagree with how Papias describes that. According to, Matthew, right? Judas hangs himself. That's the whole thing that happened. There's nothing about an inflation and a getting stuck in a city gate and a chariot. So here's an example where Papias is telling us a story, but at least if we looked at other sources, potentially sources we would trust more, sources that are earlier, they contradict what Papias tells us. Papias also tells us about the composition of Mark and Matthew, these early gospels. For instance, he says that Matthew wrote the sayings of the Lord in Hebrew. And we don't know entirely what he's talking about, but every subsequent writer who is quoting Papias is clear that he's talking about the Gospel of Matthew as it would evolve for us. Now, scholars sit there and come up with all sorts of other explanations. Oh, well, maybe he's talking about some source for the Gospel of Matthew. Maybe he's talking about some other sort of document. They make these speculations because we know as scholars exactly one thing. The Gospel of Matthew we have was not written in Hebrew. It was written in Greek. We know that it's written in Greek. It has not a trace of translation on it. It is an original work in Greek. And so, scholars make a whole bunch of confused inferences to try to figure out how is it that this thing could be right, when probably we should simply decide as scholars, or maybe Papias was just wrong. He's wrong about Judas. Why isn't he then wrong about Matthew? From other sorts of early materials, we get Irenaeus giving us traditions that Matthew seems to have been written first and then Mark. Well, today scholars are very clear that Mark is the first gospel. Irenaeus is probably wrong. And if Irenaeus got that information from Papias, we don't know because not enough of Papias survives, then maybe Papias was wrong. The problem we run in again and again with these early traditions is that they are not supported by the internal evidence of the text, nor are they supported by other texts.
Clip that. Like Hugo's dropping bombs, ladies and gentlemen.
There are some traditions we can't compare to other sorts of sources. And every single time, though, that we can compare them, they're wrong. That's the basic problem. So how do you end up with the traditions that we do have, the kinds of things that maybe Papias, Irenaeus, and Clement are saying? I think that what they're doing is the same thing that modern scholars are doing today. They are looking at these books, and they are trying to figure out from internal evidence who must have written them. When were they written? How were they written? They're making speculations like the kind that scholars make today because they didn't know. And they really wanted to know because a lot was weighted on the question of who wrote this text in ancient polemics, in ancient debates. And they were very quick to arrive at certain conclusions that we today as scholars involved in the same kind of field of inference and speculation just find less convincing.
Final thing, I think this is important. You're off to get your kid from school. And that's a powerful point you just brought up there, is that when I was reading Papias, and of course I've been talking about it here in this video, is Papias is attributing a gospel to Mark, and that attribution seems likely lifted from First Peter, or a tradition in line with First Peter, where it says that Mark is Peter's son. So here it's easy to attribute, and why they have come up with traditionally saying, well, Mark is writing down the best they can the sermons or teachings of Peter, which are then supposedly teachings of Jesus. And like, what I'm saying is modern scholars who look at this see so much Pauline fingerprint all over Mark that it's like, it's so contrary that you can see why an easy observation of an early Christian might try to do that with maybe looking at First Peter and then go, oh, Mark wrote this and it's sermons of Peter, or Matthew was a disciple of Peter. Can you comment on this about Matthew? Maybe they say he was a disciple. I know you're not a Matthean expert, so to speak. That's not like your primary text, but maybe I'm wrong. Correct me if I'm wrong. Help me understand these two texts and why they would put Mark and Matthew at the beginning.
Yeah. So it's not always obvious why these gospels might have been attributed to these figures. And we do kind of, as scholars, have to, not only try to figure out who these texts were actually written by, but then understand a little bit of how these traditions that did become so important emerge. What I think stands out to me and many other scholars is that the names of the disciples that would have, or the disciples that eventually get fixed to these texts, are ones we can actually explain from the internal evidence of these texts if you just let your mind run a little bit, let your imagination run a little bit with speculation, which is probably what the early Christians did. So let's take the Gospel of Mark. The Gospel of Mark is anonymous, doesn't name its author. But here's what the Gospel of Mark does. It gives you a whole bunch of stories from Jesus's life, including some scenes that involve only a few disciples, Peter, James, and John. The Transfiguration, Gethsemane, these are scenes that just involve those disciples. One possible way of understanding how this text gets attributed to Mark is that someone looks at this text, sees the fact that, okay, apparently this text is something that reflects some experiences that Peter, James, and John had alone. So maybe the source for this text is one of those three figures. Peter keeps looking like the number one disciple in this text. He would be a great candidate to be that figure. And so they start to think that, maybe potentially this is somehow flowing from Peter or flowing from Peter's inner circle. And they start to dwell on the character of Mark. Again, Mark is someone who is associated with Peter in the Petrine letters in the New Testament. Peter calls Mark my son, Mark, right? He's supposed to be this extremely close follower. Everything about Mark gives off the impression of somebody who, might very well have had potentially a lot more training background way around the world than a Galilean fisherman like Peter. And it's very possible that that's how you end up with Mark as the presumed author of this text. Matthew is actually probably an even better case for this kind of thing. So Matthew's also anonymous. It doesn't make much sense as a text. It's also not one that you'd expect to be written by an immediate disciple of Jesus necessarily, because it's written in Greek. That's not something we tend to think that the disciples of Jesus were writing long texts in Greek. But people are trying to figure out who this text is written by. Well, there is one interesting little feature about Matthew they might have noticed. Mark, Matthew, and Luke, all three Gospels, tell a story in which Jesus calls a tax collector to follow him. In Mark and Luke, the tax collector's name is Levi. In Matthew, the tax collector is renamed Matthew. We know that Matthew apparently knows Mark as a gospel, so clearly this author saw the name Levi in front of him and switched it to Matthew. That's another story. But if you're an ancient reader, you might wonder, well, why is it that this author has gone ahead and claimed that this figure that we know is Levi from these other gospels is named Matthew? You could imagine that some Christians started to think, well, maybe he knows that he had a different name or a real name, his real name, or maybe corrected these other gospels. Maybe because this figure is connected to Matthew, had special insight that actually this person's name was not Levi, it was Matthew. Maybe it's Matthew himself or someone very closely connected to him. And you get to this kind of quick place where you can start to believe that the gospel, the only one that actually uses this name Matthew for this figure, happens to be written by Matthew himself. So
it makes sense. It really makes sense too when you have a tax collector. By the way, let me pause real quick here. I'm sorry to interrupt the flow of here because it's about to jump into something else. But it's important that we look at Bart's section again, forgery, counterforgery. Scroll up above the example section that he gives, and he quotes one of these ancient writers. I believe it's up here. Let me see. So let's see. So historians, this is important. The authors making a false claim to have been an eyewitness. Historians were commonly maligned in antiquity for not knowing what they were talking about. Polybius, for example, attacks the historical narratives of Timaeus because of all his knowledge was based on book learning rather than personal experience. His fault. This is the quote, I think, from Polybius. It says, he does not write from the evidence of his eyes as a non-participant in the kinds of stories he narrates. He is guilty of many errors and misstatements. And if he ever comes near the truth, he resembles those painters who make their sketches from stuffed bags. He is like other historians who approach the work of in this bookish mood. We miss in them the vividness of facts, as this impression can only be produced by the personal experience of the author. So Polybius goes on then to malign historical writers who have not been through the events themselves. So you kind of wonder if these early Christians in their tradition are reading these anonymous gospels and thinking to themselves, probably catching a lot of crap from every direction, from Jews, from pagans, from you name it. And he's saying, they got to find a way to tie in a tradition that makes these guys witnesses so that it's more convincing to people, because it was seemingly a common thing that if they're not eyewitnesses, you know what it says? We miss in them the vividness of facts, as this impression can only be produced by personal experiences of the author. Polybius goes on then to malign historical writers who have not been there, been through the events themselves. And he also gives examples in the pagan examples too, after he's done. So we've already seen from Polybius the importance, I skipped way down, of eyewitness testimony in antiquity in general. This can be seen as well in the writings of Thucydides on the pagan side and Josephus on the Jewish. As Campbell has recently stressed for Thucydides, for example, the movement of the first person emphasizes the author narrator's knowledge and authority. Well, the problem is a lot of these gospels don't even play into that first person plural or first person singular. A lot of them don't. But it's almost like they know they need to have someone they claim was a witness that knows these facts, or else people are going to doubt. How do you know this? They're not going to believe them. I think that's important. All right, back to Hugo. We're almost done with his video, and I'll wrap things up, ladies and gentlemen. They have to be literate to write down and jot down numbers. So someone internally, like you said, is reading this and they're going, well, I'm not going to say the fisherman, right? At least by Matthew's account, right? They're reading it going, I don't think the fisherman would make the best literary authors. So maybe someone internally sees, well, and he's got to be smart and he's got to know how to write this kind of stuff this way. Let's give it to him. He seems the best candidate in Matthew. What do you think about like that? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that's perfectly plausible. I mean,
and mind you, before we let him continue, that fits the point of why they would give someone that seems credible, even if it isn't true, authorship, because it's better. The standard was, let's make sure someone knows, someone was there. Someone knows. So maybe these early Christians like Irenaeus and others are like, we need someone to have been there. Maybe Papias and all these guys are like, we need testimony from people who know people who were there or were there themselves. So they're fabricating apostolic or names, characters to these books to give them that kind of pedigree that even modern apologists need. They're arguing the same problem today when they're trying to go, no, it was Luke. He was a companion. They realize that if he wasn't a companion, that's problematic for their case. They need him to have been there to make it more believable and trustworthy, which is odd,
The hard part here is that these aren't very compelling or convincing arguments to us today as scholars, as everyone we are, right? Reading, studying these texts. But it doesn't need to be that convincing. It just needed to impress a few people at the time as a possibility. And from there, it's just a question of, are there any better candidates out there? And or who is actually supporting this? Because if you can get a very powerful bishop supporting this idea, or if you can get a very influential writer, let's take Papias for a second. Papias writes 5 books that apparently people are reading for the next couple hundred years. If Papias, who believed apparently Judas could get run over, right, by a chariot stuck in a city gate, is also someone willing to believe that, yeah, Matthew wrote this and Mark wrote that, eventually what you get are just people who read him, trust him, probably already inclined to him, and repeat it, and on it goes.
I want to say this though. Think about it. If Papias had the Mark we have and the Matthew we have, specifically the Matthew, how he was hung, Papias disagrees with Matthew on how Judas was killed.
Tradition.
Ladies and gentlemen, Hugo Mendez, get his books. Links will be in the description. This is in continuity with what we're doing here in a series. Your voice is refreshing, and I'm very thankful for your insights. We just scratched the surface, so we will do other episodes that dive deep into the weeds of the material you're producing. Thank you. Is there any final words we'd like to say about these eyewitness testimonies here, Dr. Hugo?
They're not eyewitness testimonies, and we have to grapple with that fact.
And you're a man of faith.
Yeah. I mean, faith is never an uncomplicated thing. This is a challenge, but it's one of those things that we have to be able to confront in the 21st century if we're going to tell an honest story of where Christianity comes from.
Don't you love it? Because they can't just say, oh, well, you bunch of non-believers wanting to sin. It's like, dude, I'm not talking to, Aaron Ra here or Matt Dillahunty, right? I'm talking to a dude who's like actually read this stuff he's probably gone to the museums and touched with white gloves the early original manuscripts, and read all of this in its original manuscript data and all of it, and he's come out and going, nah. I think that's important because guys, I can sit here and talk to people, and I will talk to people who are like me, who doubt, who don't believe. That's cool. We can do all of that. But this is important that it's coming from people. They can't pull the poison of the well, atheist card. Oh, agnostic card. Like, we don't trust you card, because it's like, bro, like, this guy, he's a man of faith, but he wants to go with the facts, and the facts are on this side. I think that's important. I respect that, and I'm thankful for your, admittance and honesty here, because, someone might just look at me. Of course, everyone knows I'm a skeptic and I'm this atheist agnostic guy, but truth be told, like, this is not an anti-God thing. You can find God in ways using this material to glean and find meaning and purpose. And I just thought that it'd be important people understand that here you and I are finding common ground based on the evidence of what the material is. It draws no conclusion at the end of the day on any spiritual matters, on what you might believe about the world, or if there's something out there that's pulling the strings, or even plays some part in the universe we live in today. I'm very thankful for you, and I hope that more people will check out your books, because you're cutting edge on John, really, in this the epistles. So I look forward to seeing those books.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I realized that
all right. So I didn't realize I was recording that whole time after, which either way, I cut stuff out when I actually cut it up. But either way, whether or not, I think that's important to hear from someone who's an expert, who's literally saying the very things that I've been saying. And I do think personally, once you know this kind of stuff, it's hard for me to, like, unless I'm just like culturally or traditionally just saying, hey, I like I like the bells and smells and the whistles and the community and all that. That's cool. I don't really buy that this guy walked out of a tomb, right? I don't buy that this really happened. I think that all this critical scholarship does lead down that path. And Bart Ehrman's is pretty scathing, because in my documentary that I'm about to do, which deals with weed passages specifically, this issue is, it's a wrestle between it's literary and inventive intentionally, which they're imitating Homer, Virgil's Aeneid. This is a well-known trope to have the weed passages show up when you get on a boat, or it is fabricated, invented, which would then put it into deception. And that is what Bart Ehrman is arguing, that this is, someone who's pretending to be there. They're pretending to be an eyewitness, which I don't know how that can be pious, but people call it pious fraud or whatever. They may believe they're doing something good because they're helping their cult grow and get attention and writing this material, but it's a dishonest move to me. It's propagandistic. Anyway, I'd love to hear what you guys say about this. Anyway, I just thought I'd do this live stream because it's been on my mind after writing so much script. Debate, testify, apologetics. He's been mildly bothering me. Look, me and Eric, we're chill. I don't agree with him at all on, I don't know, almost everything New Testament, right? His method, undesigned coincidences, all of this stuff. I actually was going to put a little video out responding to his undesigned coincidence stuff. And then I said, well, why? Maybe I will respond to some of his videos, but I've got something up my sleeve to actually respond to Lydia McGrew's book, because that's the book. And these are the people that Eric Manning is learning from. So, you might as well go to the horse themselves and actually, say, hey, this is what you're arguing. And of course, they're working off of older scholarship like Paley and others, but I'm going to address Lydia McGrew's book. And I've had some scholars in the works take the time to read this so that we can put to rest the silly undesigned coincidence nature points to historicity or reliability of some sort. I just think the whole name undesigned and coincidence doesn't even work. I don't even agree with the name. Like it just, to me, it just doesn't make any sense. And you know what? It's bad either way you slice it. And they're going to go, well, that's not cool because you have an unfalsifiable position here. But think about this. They're ultimately acting like they're detectives, almost doing like the old Josh McDowell thing, but with undesigned coincidence stuff, right? And they're saying, listen, these interlocking, subtle, unintentional overlaps happen amongst this material that just, helps it seem more valid, seem more true. And I think that's subjective alone, personally. I just think right then and there, you're already dealing with subjectivity where you think it's subtle, but the author may actually have intent for every jot and tittle they put down. But then even further is this. I see a problem. Let's take Mark and Matthew and a text. Let's say it's a whole paragraph. And Matthew copies Mark verbatim. We know that there's literary dependence here, right? Which already creates problems for the position, but let's just go ahead and run with their idea. If these were eyewitnesses reporting and I had an interview with a cop, or the cop calls me in and calls in non-believer, Baron, and worship. I'm just looking at the worship. Okay. We all come in and three of us, like in some cases, almost say the most identical thing, but two of us, Mark and Matthew, let's just use those two, for example, say exactly the same thing. Me and worship say exactly the same thing. A whole paragraph verbatim. That police officer is going to go, hey, thanks for the interview. Come in here, guys. They've been colluding. They've somehow communicated before they came in here because they have the identical testimony here. This is collusion at its best, at its finest. So if it's identical, that's a problem for them. If it's contradictory, that's a problem for them. But they don't allow contradictions. They do everything they can to get away from contradictions, but there are obvious situations where it doesn't say the same thing, which would make it a bit more believable, right? Because you'd be like, okay, if it was an eyewitness testimony, real eyewitness testimony, you would have conflicting issues, contradictions. In the real world, four of us are going to see the same car wreck. We're going to have different perceptions, different angles in which we approach this stuff, and that's fine. The problem is that if Doc Pleuromonot, non-believer, Necro, and Trusted, us four witnesses walk in there to the police, and the police get three different accounts that don't match up, but then they at least can go fact check the actual material evidence, they could probably get to the bottom of the truth. But if you can't get to the bottom of the truth by factual evidence, and they get three testimonies, two of them contradict, two of them might align, they might lean into this most likely happened, but that didn't. Instead, that's not what we get with these guys. They don't, I mean, like, I at least could say a contradictory story helps be more believable, but identical narration is problematic. And the last thing I'll say about that whole issue is I was talking to another scholar. I got their book in. Super excited about this one. Writing and Rewriting the Gospels, John and the Synoptics, James W. Barker, forward by Mark Goodacre. If you haven't got this book, get it now, because I'm going to be interviewing this scholar very soon. I'm going to be diving into this deep because he is in the same vein as Goodacre about John, but this is his like decade of deep research work and powerful stuff. John knew all three gospels, right? Mark, Matthew, and Luke. But we talked about something, and I'm going to do an interview with him on his other book, which I'm going to be getting, on the diatessaron. And what early Christians did when Tatian did this, this is fascinating. I did not know this. The diatessaron, if you don't know, was a gospel that was written that was trying to do what modern apologists, like the undesigned coincidence types, are doing, trying to say there is no contradictions. They all complement each other, and the stories are ultimately one true, historically reliable kind of, this is it, right? Now, I'm not saying Tatian was doing that, but Tatian was creating a harmonized, singular gospel. He wanted to take all four and make one text. Screw having Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Probably tired and sick of the which one do we read and which one are we going to have in the church? So he creates one gospel. Very educated guy in the Christian church. What does he do with the cleansing of the temple scene? And this blew my mind as I was talking to James Barker the other day on my walk on the cell phone. We were just sitting there, and I'm like, James, so let's talk about some of this stuff. Like, what's up? You know, I hang out with scholars on the phone all the time, learning from them. And he said, Tatian. So first, let me give you the Gospels and then what Tatian does. Mark, Matthew, and Luke practically imply the reason Jesus was killed. We know he was claiming to be king of the Jews, or he was claiming to be a Messiah. We hear the dude cleansed the temple in Jerusalem. Like he went in, according to these stories, and caused a major ruckus in the Jerusalem temple in Jerusalem. Okay. So in those gospels, they capture him, arrest him on trial. Ultimately, he goes to his death and gets crucified. The dude, his last week of his life is crucified because he cleanses the temple, creating such a stir and gets attention and gets himself killed. Mark, Matthew, and Luke. John, 3 years earlier before he dies, cleanses the temple. Jesus cleanses the temple. What do the apologists do? From my understanding, is they say he cleansed the temple twice. Because John, at the beginning of John's, ministry of Jesus, he cleanses the temple 3 years before he dies, like early of his ministry. By the way, it's a years-long ministry. It's not a very short, truncated ministry we see in Mark, Matthew, and Luke. At the end of Jesus's ministry in Mark, Matthew, and Luke, cleanses the temple, boom, they arrest him, he dies. So the cleansing of the temple is an important, pivotal turn. If there was a real historical Jesus that actually did this, he got his ass arrested, okay? And this would do it, okay? This would do it. It happened to Judas the Galilean. He was cleansing the temple. He got arrested for leading a revolt for taxation and such. So this happens to Jesus. He gets arrested. Then you get to John, beginning of the ministry. So here's what we have. We have 3 years ago, right before his death, Tyson writes his gospel. What does he do? He doesn't put it at the beginning. He doesn't put it at the end. He sticks it a year before the death of Jesus. So Tyson's creating a harmonization text butchers both the traditions of John and the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. He literally creates a whole new Jesus, a whole new story. Once you've butchered them, then you've created your own thing. And in fact, that's what James Tabor says all the time. When we talk about Mark, he says, let Mark be Mark. Let Matthew be Matthew. If you try to harmonize and make Mark agree and connect to all these others and make them say the same thing like apologists do, you are actually butchering that author's text. You're changing Mark. Mark needs to be Mark. Matthew needs to be Matthew. Luke needs to be Luke. Let each author be each author. And so I think that's fascinating. Anyway, I went on a rant, but I hope that sounded interesting to you guys as much as it did to me. Let's see. What's up, everybody? Exactly. Every coincidence is undesigned. I know. That's a good point. Yeah, we are DNA. Of course, man. Super interesting. I think it is the fact that Tyson writing his own gospel, and James kind of made a point, and he wrote a book on this too. It's on Amazon. He kind of made a point. James Barker, for those, again, the book, made a point that there are other examples like that in Tyson's Diatessaron that seem to imply what he's doing is he's kind of creating his own gospel at this point. Another gospel. We already got plenty of those running around, but he's doing another one. And he's likely doing it. I'd be curious to know what sources he's working with, but he's likely doing it with the canonical material. I don't know that, though, because I don't know if even canon is on the stage yet. When did Tyson write his Diatessaron? Let's see. We have a scholarly consensus here. So Tyson composed the Diatessaron around 170 to 175 CE. That's pretty early, actually. Considering like he's compiling this material, and I'm wondering what books specifically he's using. First, so Diatessaron, Tyson, first gospel harmony, merging Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John into one narrative. Might as well call James, but I don't want to bug him. Are there any other gospels he may be using to create his? I'm asking ChatGPT just to see if they have any because sometimes they'll bring up critical scholars that yes, there's a strong scholarly evidence that Tatian's diatessaron may have drawn on more than just the 4 canonical gospels. The consensus is that Tatian primarily used Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and several features strongly suggest he also incorporated other gospel traditions, either written or oral. Many scholars, especially in early Syriac studies, argue that certain readings in the diatessaron resemble Gospel of the Hebrews, Gospel of the Nazarenes, Gospel of the Ebionites. These are Jewish Christian Gospels. Interesting. Did Tatian use the Gospel of Thomas? Some scholars say possibly. Tatian used the Gospel Harmony already circulating before him, Justin Martyr's Gospel. So this is very important. Justin Martyr, Tatian's teacher, quotes a gospel that sometimes matches the synoptics, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes harmonizes them already, sometimes has unique material. Bro, we're dealing with the wild, wild west. We're dealing with the wild, wild west of Christianity, and I love it. All right, everybody, 2 hours, 44-minute live stream. I've been hanging out. It's been a minute, hasn't it? I love you all. Thank you so much for being here. Even, with people who come in, they're poking at me, jabbing at me, and all that kind of stuff. Look, it just makes the show, interesting. So I will definitely try to do this more often. Any final things from you all? I'd like to hear from you before we wrap it up. Is there anything you want to leave me with, or a quick question I can answer before I go? Alan says cheers. Have a great night. Eat well, live better, Derek. I am now. Trust me, I am. Just going through some tough times, but that's life, Everybody has those. Glad to see you back on the saddle, brother. I'm on, man. I'm trying. I'm going to start cooking some stuff. I'll wait for more comments, but I'll talk in the meantime briefly. I have a 3-hour video written by Steve Mason, not by me, by the man who wrote the books on Luke Acts using Josephus. And then he added an addendum chapter when I wrote him, thanks to a Christian apologist on Facebook who actually said, well, how do you know that Josephus didn't borrow from Luke Acts? And I'm glad he asked. And then Steve Mason wrote another several-page response to add to the thing, which made it even longer. So it was 3 hours by the time we got done. So there's that being edited right now. I have a video that's going to come out about the failed prophecy of Tyre. The Bible records a failed prophecy, and it admits it failed. And then the same prophet creates another prophecy, and that failed. It's crazy. Then I got another one I just finished yesterday narrating, which was a pain in my butt. And that one is the We Passage one. And that one's going to be close to 2 hours, 45 minutes, up to 3 hours. It's going to be a long one. But it goes through the examples in depth. The parables were used because there was dual meaning of Hebrew words. Okay. Have a good time all the time. I tried, DJ. Beach says, thanks, Derek. I was late in. Sorry. No worries. We are DNA. Thanks again, dude. Much appreciated. Thank you. Great chat today, folks. Missed this venue. We are going to have to do this more. We, first person plural. Have a great none. Good night, Derek. Yes, great show. Thank you so much. We will discuss this topic of early Hebrew more if you are here on another live. And then Average Joe, cool atheist. Can't wait to see more of what's coming from you, Derek. Thank you so much. I got a lot coming, so get ready. Get ready, ladies and gentlemen. And never, ever forget, we are Myth Vision. Peace.
Son, do you want to know what the truth is? After this, there's no turning back. You take the blue pill and you wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to. You take the red pill and you stay in Wonderland, and I show you just how deep the rabbit hole goes. Remember, all I'm offering is the truth, nothing more.